So the title of my talk is Making a Difference, How to Maximize the Impact of Your Organization on the Development of Energy Efficiency Portfolios. And I'm assuming that most everyone on this call is interested in, at some point in time, in trying to get involved in some of these processes that are used to both develop programs, develop funding levels, and theoretically at least save energy. And this talk is primarily going to focus on, well, where's the best place to intervene if you have a specific set of objectives for your organization, whether it's promoting more savings in the residential sector or working with the commercial sector or working with a specific technology. Whatever your objectives are, I'm going to try to give you a roadmap for how and where to intervene and how you can be most effective. And before I start, I have a few thoughts on portfolio planning that I'd like you to keep in your mind as we go through this presentation. And the first one is the most important. Begin with the end in mind. If you're ever getting into a portfolio process, development process, which can be labor intensive, make sure you have in your heads, what do I want to get out of this? Why am I intervening? What specific strategic objectives do I have? And if you use that to guide your intervention, you're more likely to be successful. It's usually not a good idea just to be involved in the process and sort of play along because, it's harder for interveners to be as successful given that other players in the game often have more resources and more staff. So you have to think strategically. The second thing I would say that I want people to think is the road to heck is paved with many different problems. And the first one is good assumptions. People always make assumptions in portfolio planning processes that never actually get tested. And so a good intervener, in my view, will say, hey, where did you come up with this assumption that, for example, on-bill financing will never work? Or where did you come up with this assumption that said we can't make any differences with television set efficiencies? So always think about assumptions that are being made and ask questions if you can. Secondly, lots of people have really good intentions in these processes, but intentions don't often translate to action. So you have to think about, all right, I've got a good intention. How do I actually make it work? And finally, you should be skeptical when people introduce program designs to you and say, oh, we're sure it's going to work. It's always a good idea to have some kind of testing process, particularly if it's a new program design, because people make lots of assumptions about what will work, and that often doesn't work in the real world. And finally, from a high-level perspective, the most important thing that I think should be thought about in planning processes, but often isn't, is feedback. People get very in tune and enmeshed in how do we develop a portfolio plan, and how do we make sure that we have enough funding, and how do we reach customers. But I think it's important to think about in this process, how are you going to get feedback after you're done, after the portfolio plan is adopted by whatever agency you're in front of? How are you going to get feedback on whether it's working, both to the people who are delivering the programs and to the people who participated in the planning process itself? So I have 8 objectives today, and I want you to look back at these objectives later on and make sure that I covered them, and if I didn't, you should ding me on my evaluation. So first objective is we're going to learn and have fun, and I'm going to try to make that happen, even though sometimes it's hard to do that talking on a phone, and not being able to see people's body language and reactions to what we're saying. Secondly, I want to give you a set of definitions of, what is a portfolio and, what is a program, et cetera, so you can use that when you're thinking about the process of intervening. Third, I want to talk about the range of policy goal approaches that are used and how people develop policy goals and whether or not it's a good idea for interveners to get involved in developing policy goals. That's one of your choices. Or is it best to let other people, like the legislature, set policy goals and you work on portfolio and program development, which is, given a goal, how do we get a set of programs out there to meet our needs? I'm going to talk a little bit about what we found in our review of portfolio planning processes across the United States and Canada in terms of what are best practices. I'm going to try to give you some insights about where to intervene in a process, and then talk a little bit about something that I don't think a lot of people talk too much about in the development process, and I think you need to talk about it more, which is how do we identify what are the risks to us being successful? People usually say, oh, we're going to save lots and lots of energy for a very low cost. It's going to cost less than a cent per kilowatt hour. So how do you identify the risks of it not working out, and how do you mitigate them? And one good example of a risk that a lot of people didn't think about is the recession, right? We've got lots of portfolio planning processes that went along with the assumption of, well, we're going to continue to have rapid growth in the commercial and residential sector. And then lo and behold, 2008 came, and a lot of their portfolios were at risk because they had assumed lots of savings, which were contingent on economic growth that didn't happen. And finally, we're going to give a summary of what I think the important key takeaway points are from this presentation. And let me just remind you again that if you have any questions or concerns, you should be typing those into the message box so we can pick them up and answer them later.
Dude, if you don't go to Besties, you'll hate yourself.
Hold on. Doing a little bit of crowd control there. Okay, so the circle of energy efficiency life. This slide here is just to show you what we're going to talk about today. We're talking about mainly the development of policy goals and portfolio development, different types of programs. We are not talking about implementation or program tracking and how that should work. And we're going to talk, Steve is going to talk primarily about evaluation, both in terms of impacts and cost effectiveness and process. But if you're interested in these other two boxes, which is how do you actually implement a program and track success or failure, you'll have to go to a different course. Okay, so we've already talked a little bit about this. I'm just repeating here. We're going to look at a range of energy efficiency goals, how they're developed, and where to intervene for the interveners. We'll talk about pros and cons of these different processes, discuss where to intervene, model portfolio plans, and success metrics to follow their progress, and the risks in meeting these particular portfolio goals and mitigation of them. Okay, so the first and most important question is, if we're developing a portfolio, what is a portfolio? Well, the definition that we use that I think is taken from best practices, it's developing a set of energy efficiency programs designed to work strategically and comprehensively to promote the adoption of specific technologies, practices, and/or programs at the market level to achieve a very specific set of policy objectives or goals that hopefully a regulatory commission or a state has set out as this is what we want to accomplish. But what we find is that often policy goals and objectives are left vague because of the process of compromising in the legislative process or other kinds of compromises at the commission level, and that potentially results in chaos and controversy later. So one of the most important questions that you should be asking in the back of your mind when you're in a portfolio process is, how will I know, was the portfolio successful? What is the metric that I'm going to use? And knowing who actually is going to set and adopt these policy goals and essentially adopt any objectives is crucial to understanding when and how to intervene. It may be that it's more important to intervene at the policy level because the goals are completely clear, or unclear, excuse me. Or if you think you have a good set of policy goals and you just need to work on getting program development, then you might want to choose to stay away from policy goal development and concentrate on where the rubber meets the road in terms of developing an actual portfolio plan of energy efficiency programs. Next slide. So I'm not going to read through these definitions because it's going to be a waste of time, but I want you to be able to refer to these as we go through this presentation. It's important to know the distinction between gross and net energy savings, and whether or not when you're planning the portfolio, whether the administrators are talking about gross savings or net savings. It's also important to know when, if there's a requirement or if you think it's important for your strategic goals to estimate co-benefits from energy efficiency like GHG emission reductions or pollution reductions or job creation, that you explicitly talk about who's going to do that and what data needs to be collected to estimate co-benefits. It shouldn't be something that you do at the end of the process or in an annual report after the fact. If you want it to happen, you need to set up the processes during the portfolio development process to get accurate estimates. And finally, there's a lot of people who talk about market transformation, and if that's a goal of that particular portfolio development process, it's good to have an agreement on what market transformation is. I know because I participated in the process in early 2000 in California where some people thought market transformation was the process of making sure we didn't need to have programs anymore in the future. We were going to transform the market magically so that prices would be the only signal necessary for customers. Other people thought market transformation was working to make sure that certain inefficient products weren't available to customers anymore, either through standards or through just trying to promote the sales of more efficient products. So it's important to make sure that if you're going to set market transformation as a goal, you all agree on what it is. So that's the purpose of having these definitions. Okay, now we're going to talk about choices, choices, choices. And to me, this is important because interveners, by definition, have limited budgets. So you need to think about, where is my intervention likely to be the most successful? So the first and most important strategic choice for interveners, and I alluded to this earlier, is do I want to intervene in the legislature or at some high level, at a policy level with commissioners, to try to influence the development of policy goals themselves? You know, I want to write legislation or try to make sure that the PUC adopts some goal that says, thou shalt do the following things. Or is it better for me, given my resources, to try to accept the policy goals as they are and work on developing the programs in partnership either with utilities or other actors in the process, and attempting to secure either more resources and or the cooperation of market players like vendors or manufacturers to achieve them? In my experience, most advocacy organizations these days appear to be choosing option 2. They have more strength, and they have more people willing to listen to them if they're in an open meeting process where they're developing portfolios. But on the other hand, there are some organizations that may be more influential at the legislative in the arena. So, again, it's just a choice that you need to make, and I would, it depends on your sort of track record in both places. I think it's difficult to do both at the same time in a jurisdiction, but that may be a choice you want to make as well. Okay, so let's review a little bit more about the first option. So first off, this is an important Rorschach test for everybody. Is the sun rising or is the sun falling in this particular slide? The reason I ask that is that if the people who say the sun's rising tend to be more optimistic, and I would suggest they tend to go towards policy goal changes or interventions. The people who see this as the sun setting, they say, we can't really affect what the politicians are going to do, but we can do a lot in the portfolio development process for my local utility. So I would guess that everybody on this call should look at this, and maybe if you want to, in the message box, say whether you think it's rising or setting, and the reasons why. But that's just a little diversion. And I'll tell you the answer at the end of this slideshow. So what types of policy goals are usually set for energy efficiency portfolios? I've given you some categories here, and different organizations, different interveners prefer different types. One that's usually touched base on in most statements that you read is cost effectiveness. They're going to say achieve a certain amount of energy or peak savings goals within some budget constraint or within some, cost effectiveness test, like make sure that the benefit cost ratio is greater than 1. There's also more qualitative statements made, like make sure that you do energy efficiency first before any other resource in the loading order. That one was popular in California for a while and some other states. Okay, so those are sort of high-level cost effectiveness. The other types of savings goals are, when we'll spend more time with this later, is you can set absolute values, like achieve 100 megawatts by 2012, or you can say make sure that you reduce energy use by some percentage off the baseline usage in let's say 2010 or 2011. There's other states like Texas that have tended towards going, let's try to reduce savings to reduce the percent load growth from 2% to 1% per year, for example. And then finally, I would say the latest wave of savings goals are per capita reductions. Let's achieve a certain percentage reduction in per capita savings. If the current level is 10,000 kilowatt hours per capita, let's get to 3% less than that over the next 5 years. Then finally, I'm not going to read through all this because I don't have time. There's equity goals, lost opportunity goals, various types of resource planning goals, reducing wholesale market costs and forward capacity markets, for example. And there's a new type of goal that is being considered, which is I call integrative, and that is trying to set some goals saying the combination of energy efficiency, DG and DR goals needs to lead to some percentage reduction in either fossil fuel use for the whole system or overall system generation might be reduced and on-site generation might be increased. So that's another example. Okay, here's some pros and cons of pursuing different policy goals. And I'm not going to read through these. I just want you to have these to look through at your leisure because we've got lots of slides to get through here. Basically, you need to think about your strengths and weaknesses and where you want, for example, if you think you have lots of economists on your staff and they know a lot about cost effectiveness and the costs and benefits of energy, you might want to go to cost effectiveness goals. I would say most advocates in the past have gone towards energy savings goals because they've got strong analytical capabilities, and it's easier to set those, and they don't necessarily translate to reductions in overall total energy use, but they look good on paper because you can, say, well, we reduced what might have happened without the program to some different level, and so that results in higher levels of savings. And then finally, I think there's a lot of advocacy groups that fight for equity reasons. They are, worried that program administrators are going to put most of their money towards commercial and industrial customers because it's easier to reach them and in some cases more cost effective. So their objective is basically to fight for folks without representation in the process and make sure that there's funding for things like low-income programs and residential programs. Sorry, this slide doesn't go as fast as I want it to. So there's also some policy goals here, lost opportunity goals that have been written into legislation in some places and other places just at the commission level, resource planning goals, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the pros and cons of these, but you can read these at your leisure. Okay, there's basically 4 types of processes that have been used to develop policy goals for energy efficiency programs, and you should be aware of what kind of process exists at your state, and it tells you, I think, a good deal about how to intervene or where to intervene. Legislative, regulatory, collaborative, and appointed board. And my experience is that advocates tend to have the most success in collaborative processes because they sort of have an equal place at the table. But the downside of those is that they tend to take a lot of time and it's hard to get a consensus. I would say the next most is probably regulatory. And then I think there's some groups that have had a lot of success legislatively, like NRDC. So it really depends on your organization, where you want to start, and where you think that policymakers are likely to be most receptive to your message. Okay, I've already talked a little bit about the types of energy and peak savings goals. These are just examples of, the states that have actually used these. Texas, percentage of load growth, percentage of base savings, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Connecticut. Some states like California do a potential study and then they agree on some level of achievable savings and set that over time. And there's continual revisions to those goals that happen like every 2 or 3 years. Other jurisdictions use an absolute megawatt hour goal. And interestingly, a lot of states are not completely clear about when they set goals, either for the utility or for the state, whether they're setting the goals as net or gross. So you should be clear when you're talking about savings goals that people know ahead of time whether we're talking net or gross savings. Okay, now a little bit about portfolio and program development. This slide is just a reminder that there's always a lot of people looking into this process, but sometimes they never really choose to get engaged. And these kangaroos are an example of people who are good lookers but not necessarily good doers. Okay, this is the second option for interveners is, should we intervene in portfolio mix development, the mix of programs and budgets for those programs? The opportunities you have depend on these bullets here. The processes that are being used to develop portfolio, is it internal or external public meeting? Who is going to make the final decision on the portfolio mix? Whether or not there's available market data to support certain types of programs and measure their success or failure, and whether or not expertise exists, both either within the utility organization or third-party implementers to actually develop the programs. Often we find that program administrators need to be encouraged to do their homework before the process starts. What we find is often the portfolio development process starts and people start asking questions and people have a blank look like, well, we have no idea how many residential households are in this state, or what percentage of them have TV sets, or how many TV sets per house, or other things. So it's always a good idea to try to get people to do their homework before the process starts. And then you need to assess whether or not the policymakers in this particular place have the ability to develop concrete objectives, or whether they need a staff to sort of feed them objectives and work on suggesting to them this would be a good objective to set. And my experience is that some policymakers want to do all their own policy goal development, and others are interested in seeing suggestions from interveners and other parties, and they like to pick and choose. And then I think another important thing to look at is the presence or absence of performance payments for the administrators. If there are performance payments and they're significant, it makes the atmosphere for developing portfolio much more tense, and there's a lot of people who are worried about winning or losing their jobs or salary bonuses depending on the outcome. So people tend to be a lot more combative in processes where there's performance payments that have been decided on. Next slide. So there's a range of approaches for developing portfolio program portfolios. There's what I call a regulatory passive approach, regulatory active approach, and collaborative. And let me spend a little bit of time about that. A passive approach usually is the administrator or the public utility commissioner, whoever's the oversight body, says, bring me a rock. Bring me testimony that supports whatever money you want, whatever programs you want, whatever savings you want. And it's up to usually the utility program administrator to bring the rock. And then everybody else, the interveners and everyone else, reacts to that rock and criticizes, makes comments on the testimony. There may be testimony hearings, etc. So that's a process that can be productive if people have the right mind frame, but it also can be very counterproductive because lawyers can get into this mode of, well, we're going to attack everybody, including interveners' testimony, because we don't like it. We want to show that our testimony is the best and we're the best people on the block. So in that particular case, if you're going to intervene, you need to have a set of people who are skilled at answering questions on the witness stand and not overreacting when people try to goad them into overreacting by saying, well, isn't it true that, etc. The regulatory active, which I think has been started in lots of states now, is it's not just good enough to say, bring me a rock. What tends to happen is people say, okay, we want to make sure that there are inputs where everybody has a chance to sort of put in their point of view. We want to encourage people to work towards consensus. If you don't reach consensus, we're going to require a case management statement from the parties where everybody says, okay, we are able to agree on 10 issues, but these 3 we can't, and here's the pros and here's the cons for each of these 3 issues, and let people identify themselves that way. And finally, there's a collaborative process, which works occasionally, but again, has the problems that we've talked about before of it's hard to get a collaborative to agree on a schedule and stick to it. And often it's hard to get, it takes a while for the consultant team or whoever the leader is of this collaborative to gain enough stature so that people follow their direction, as opposed to constantly saying, well, I want to go in a different direction. I'm not with you, Mr. Leader or Mrs. Leader. So that's sort of the potential problem with that process. Okay, there's 2 other approaches. There's often quasi-legislative, where the legislature or an agency may say, well, we need to have a set of hearings. We'll ask for either the state agency or some independent administrator to facilitate those hearings, come up with a budget proposal, and bring it back to us, and we'll have a set of decision makers either at the state agency level or some independent non-profit organization will make the final decision. And finally, there's some some portfolio development processes that are run sort of internal to a nonprofit organization, and they have the choice of whether they want to have public, discussions of a portfolio, or whether they want to keep it internal and just invite funders of their nonprofit in to make decisions about the portfolio itself. Okay, this is a discussion of the pros and cons of these different portfolio approaches that we've just reviewed, the development approaches. And I'm going to try to just go high level on this again because I don't want to waste your time reading all these things. My impression is the passive approach, the pros are it's the most time efficient because usually there's a regulatory person who's in charge, and they can say, this is the schedule, you have to meet these deadlines. If you don't meet these deadlines, we're going to make a decision anyways. And it usually works best if they've taken steps to make sure that the program administrators' own goals within their company are aligned with public goals. So, for example, they believe that pursuing energy efficiency programs is going to lead to higher profit or higher overall return to the company, as opposed to being something that they just have to do because it's a public benefit obligation, but they don't really want to succeed too well because it will either reduce their profits or reduce their revenues. The con that I see in this is that in many of these passive processes, it's difficult to get standing, and it takes a lot to actually develop testimony and be effective in that process. And so I consider those to be sort of barriers to public entry. And so if there's a lot of barriers, you probably don't want to intervene in that process. The active process, again, can lead to good outcomes if the process is pretty well facilitated and people have set prescribed timelines. The objective of an active process is to narrow the number and scope of issues that have to come before decision makers and try to get most of the decision making to happen in that public process before it gets to the PUC commissioner or whoever's making the decision. The downside of that, as you might guess, is the use of workshops and extensive advisory groups can lead to delays, and it has in many different cases. If the process is not well structured with deadlines, and if there's not, this is one thing that I want to emphasize, many portfolio processes don't close the loop. And what I mean by that is that if an intervener or any party says, I have this set of questions or I have this set of recommendations, please, Mr. or Mrs. Program Administrator, take my recommendations into account, and then there's silence. There's no requirement that the program administrator or who's ever running the programs actually has to respond back to that comment and say, thank you for that comment. I'm either going to do this with that comment or I'm not going to take that comment for these reasons. If you don't close the loop, then you've got a lot of people wasting their time sending comments in and it never comes back out. So you need to make sure that there's someone in authority and there's an agreement that people are going to close the loop between comment and response. The next process that I wanted to review briefly is the collaborative, and I would say in theory that's the best approach if you can make sure you have all of the perspectives that get involved in the collaborative. In practice, some collaboratives, as I think many of the interveners on this phone realize, lead to long delays because parties have no incentive to reach agreement during a prescribed time period, and you have people hiring dueling experts that can't, for whatever set of reasons, decide that they can't get along. The quasi-legislative process run by energy agencies is easier for the state or its agents because they think that they represent the public interest, and they feel like by having a workshop process, they can hear all of the private interests and come to some synthesis of the best public interest. The problem that I see with quasi-legislative processes or processes run by state agencies is it's difficult to penalize public actors who make mistakes or run programs that are failures. There's no easy way to say, okay, Mike Messenger, you presided over the development of $10 million of demand response programs, and they were all failures, therefore you're fired. In many agencies, there's lots of tenure, and so you can fail, and there's no real consequence to your action. So that's why, in general, I'm a little bit worried about having agencies run programs because there's no market discipline. Finally, the last approach is the internal portfolio development nonprofit. It's good for the funding agency and the stakeholders who are funding this because they feel like they're being responded to, but it's bad for the public because often they're not invited to the party. Next slide. Okay, this is just a listing of possible portfolio objectives that any of you on the intervener side or advocate side might want to take. And a lot of these have been tried in different states, and I could talk a little bit, if you want to, in the question and answer about which of these are the best. I just want to give you a list. I think the one that has been tried most often is just maximize energy or peak savings within or outside of program cost caps. California and to a certain extent Massachusetts have tried, maximize net benefits produced with a shared savings approach. One that's been tried, I think, in the Northwest is, a policy goal that says every time that you work with a customer, make sure you achieve deep and comprehensive savings at each premise. Don't just walk away after you've handed them 3 CFLs. That's one that tends to be more costly but may have more long-term effects. One that hasn't been tried out most recently is explicitly trying to maximize private investment in energy efficiency. In other words, leverage. If we're spending, $1 million in our program, we'd like to be able to say that we leverage $2 million of private investment through our incentives or something like that. And to me, it's a good idea to think about, do you really want to try to maximize leverage, particularly if you have a small budget or if you're in a jurisdiction that's just starting up, because you can get more bang for the buck if you can get a lot of private actors doing, making sure that you reach your objectives without having to spend a lot of money to make them do that. In other words, making it in their interest. Finally, the other types of objectives are, in many places, there's a specific resource planning goal. Like in Canada, when I was in Ontario, the goal was, we don't want to build any more coal power plants, period, ! And we want to get rid of the existing ones. So they tried to design programs that would make that happen. Finally, another one that I think equity advocates tend to like, but they never, it's difficult to get commissions to actually adopt them, which is, we want to maximize the fraction of the populations that are participating in programs. And so an example of that might be, look, within the first 5 years, we want to make sure that at least 10% of the customers in our service territory, residential customers, let's say, have participated in some program. So that's an equity type goal. And then finally, I think an implicit goal that many utilities adopt is we want to maximize customer satisfaction and loyalty to ourselves in everything we do in our programs. And that, that's not necessarily good or bad, but I think it's usually a good one if you make sure that it gets measured somewhere in the process. Next slide coming up. So what does this, I want to give you sort of a checklist of how do you know if you've done a successful portfolio plan process? And this is just, this may sound like, motherhood and apple pie, but I would imagine that if you go through many portfolio plans, you'll find that they don't have all of these things. So again, there should be a clear set of policy goals and objectives, a clear mission statement for the administrator saying, this is what I'm going to do, these are my roles and these are my responsibilities, these are the people who are going to be in charge of evaluating my programs, this is how we're going to work with them. A clear summary of what people perceive the current market environment needs is with respect to receptivity to energy efficiency investments, and whatever strategies are going to be used to work with the private sector as well as with just general citizens to achieve success. There should be program budgets and a statement of the anticipated load impacts, ideally with some uncertainty around those, but you'll find that most people don't want to do that. Clear metrics of what will constitute success both for individual programs and the portfolio. And this one is really usually not written down, but I think you should talk about it. In fact, I encourage people after a portfolio development process to have a meeting at the end of the whole process where people get together and say, okay, did we all buy into this? Do we have sort of agreement that these are the strategies that are going to work? And that do we have a set of market actors who say, yes, we're willing to play, we're willing to contribute, we want to be part of this effort. Next slide. So here's some common development strategies, and I think it would be interesting for people to try and think about which of these strategies do you think is being used in your local jurisdiction. The first one is minimize regulatory risk. Use only tried and true EE programs that have been shown to be successful in the past. Don't fund pilot programs unless you're sure they're going to work. And that one I think has been used successfully in Florida, Iowa, Indiana, and to a certain extent Maine. The second one is the opposite of that, which is let's maximize risk-taking. We want to go after the highest level of future energy peak savings that we can. We want to push the envelope. It has sort of a medium risk, and an example of that is New York, the 15-15 strategy. 15% reduction in 2015, and I would say that that's a really ambitious goal. California had similarly ambitious goals in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and I would say that both Maryland and Illinois have some pretty ambitious goals too going forward. And then the third type is not maximize program savings, but maximize market savings, which is the sum of both program-induced savings plus actions taken by private buyers and sellers on their own to do energy efficiency. And it's important to do some sort of market tracking so you can see whether your program is like the only game in town and you're like 95% of the market is attributed to utilities, or whether there's some balance and 50% of the savings that you see happening in the market is due to a utility program or some form of public program, and the other 50% is people doing it on their own, sort of a spillover effect. And I think this type of goal has worked well for the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance to a certain extent in Massachusetts, and it's supposed to work for California in 2009 to 2011. We haven't yet figured out whether it's going to work. Next slide coming up. Okay, so here's some places where we should talk a little bit about the portfolio development process. The first thing you should ask yourself as an intervener is there a way that I can influence the development of the mission statement, what the utility is going to be asked to do? And the second thing is you should make sure if you're participating in the process, try to make sure you know that everybody has agreement on what are the policy goals that have been set and whether there's any flexibility in those goals, whether there's some process. Hopefully the program administrator will come in and say, here's what we see in the current market and regulatory environment and opportunities that we want to pursue. The structuring of the process should be designed to achieve buy-in by all the actors involved in the process, and we should be trying to ask the administrator, what are the key drivers that are likely to drive customer participation? You give us a forecast, but what things should we watch that might change, like the economy or mass media coverage of global climate change, or whether or not a specific power plant is built or not. There's a lot of different things that could change customer participation, and we want to think about how those might evolve over time. The other three bullets are pretty perfunctory. Make sure that you have roles and responsibilities set out for everybody in the process. Make sure that the program administrators are clear about what they are going to do and when they're going to bring in other experts into the process or not. And this is one that I think a lot of people don't think about in advance, but I think is important if you're involved in setting up a development process. You need many different personality types in a portfolio development process. You need people who have good organizational skills. You need other people who can sort of think outside the box. I call them brainstormers. Blue sky thinkers who want to look at a program from a particularly different perspective, completely different perspective. You need people who can integrate the work of various people involved in the development process. You need some people who are specialized. I'm just a market researcher, and all I know is I can tell you something about the demographics of the residential sector and what it's likely they're going to be buying in the next 5 to 10 years, for example. And you need a certain set of what I call energy efficiency analysts who can take input from market actors and from interveners and say, okay, is this going to be cost effective or not? What level of savings do we need to achieve given a certain amount of budget to pass the sort of cost effectiveness test that may be driving the development of the portfolio? In terms of the portfolio development process too, the other thing that I've mentioned before is agree on the final product. You can use the template outlines, and I'm going to give you an example on the next slide of what a final product might look like. You should try to make sure that someone has done a market scan and discussing likely trends in things like energy prices, costs of energy efficiency measures, what's the likely growth of economics development in each sector, residential, commercial, industrial. And one of the things I recommend is try to bring in trade allies to this market scan. A trade ally might be someone who sells HVAC equipment or maintains HVAC equipment. Lighting distributors, big box people like Lowe's or Home Depot. What do they think their overall sales trends are, and how does EE fit into that picture? And then I would always ask that you try to get somebody who knows something about emerging technologies, so you can think about, well, maybe there's some technologies that are just in the marketplace, and we might be able to develop programs, or not in the marketplace, in the lab, and we might be develop programs that can bring them to the marketplace. And then finally, there should be some kind of a discussion about, what market, after we sort of talked about what we don't know, what market research might be needed to fill the gap for the next process that might be 3 years later. So here's some examples of things that I think interveners and everyone in the process need to know now. It's important, I think, to talk about the customer segment size. How many residential homes are there? How many commercial establishments are there? How many industrial? What's their percentage mix in the total electricity sales and peak breakdown for that utility? To what extent is there information about end-use breakdowns available? It's nice, I think, to bring that in at the very beginning of the process so people can say, gee, residential lighting is 15% of the residential use, so we want to focus on that. Or, gee, in our place, it's only 5% in our particular territory, so maybe we don't want to focus on that. We want to focus on something different. One of the things that I think is sort of up and coming in this area is people are doing calculations of, well, how much electricity use is associated with entertainment functions in a residential household. And that goes to everything from, television sets to all different kinds of audio equipment to a variety of other things. And that's becoming a larger share of total residential use over time, and we can see some programs being developed there. You might want to know something about building structural characteristics, percentage of the buildings that are adequately insulated, different kinds of window coverings and that type of thing. To the extent that there's been research done on customer decision-making processes or how trade allies make decisions, I think that's important in terms of program design and development. If there's any information about the size and the relative influence of different sales channels, both for appliances as well as media channels, what media is the most influential in a market, that's important. Information from DOE or other state organizations about equipment and appliance sales trends by efficiency level or bin. And then I think probably one of the most important things that tends to get ignored in these processes, well, what's the baseline energy use trend? Is it up or down on a per household basis or a per square foot basis in the commercial sector? And that's a good indicator of where you might want to intervene. And then, of course, if there's any information on savings potential studies or someone's done calculated cost of conserved energy for different types of measures, that's always important. And all these sort of things should be memorialized in some sort of program development template so people can bring in this information systematically, and you as an intervener don't have to go out and do this research. Hopefully the program administrator does the research ahead of time. So here's an example of a portfolio template that's been used in many states, and Steve Schiller has been involved in the development of many of these. It's basically an outline that says, give us an overview of the plan, some set of program summary tables about costs and expected savings, descriptions of the programs, whatever management and implementation strategies are going to be used and how that's going to feed back to people that are involved in the process, reporting and tracking systems that have been set up. Are they going to be available on a quarterly basis every year? When are people going to hear about how programs are doing in different markets? There should be a section on how are we going to assure quality and make sure that we evaluate and verify the savings that people are attempting to get. How do utilities achieve cost recovery for their programs and different aspects of their programs? Can they apply for changes in funding level in the middle of the process or not? What types of cost effectiveness analysis are going to be filed when, and how are they going to be filed? Do people get a chance to comment on them? Do they want to have a chance to comment on them, et cetera? And then some information about whether the plan is in compliance with whatever set of policy goals that have been set, whether they're energy savings goals or other types of goals. And finally, there's usually a detailed set of appendices for specific information requirements that's specific to that particular regulatory organization. Next slide. I don't know what that means, but what do we need to know before the next portfolio is built? And again, I was talking a little bit about this before. After you finish a portfolio development process, you should be the responsibility of the program administrator to say, okay, I'm going to write down what we found out during this process that we didn't know and try to decide if I have the budget to develop information so I can know this next time around 3 years from now. That's the cycle. And some of the things that I think are important to know are, what's the program penetration by market segment? What percentage of the programs have actually reached customers in the target segments of interest? What have we learned about customers' willingness to pay for different kinds of more expensive efficiency products over time? And have we been able to track incremental cost over time? You know, one of the great success stories in my mind over the last 10 years that hasn't really been adequately described or tracked in portfolio planning processes is the cost of a CFL. You know, when I started in this business, a CFL cost $20 a bulb. Okay, now in some packs they sell for 90 cents a bulb, but people were not explicitly tracking that, and I would say as a result got into some problems with net to gross measurements later on, because at some point in time, the price of an efficiency measure, if it drops by a factor of 10, people are going to start buying it on their own, and you can make the case that you don't need to continue programs after it reaches a certain threshold. So it's important to track that cost information if you can. The other thing that I think is always important to track is, do you have repeat customers? In other words, do you have programs that participate in one program and then come back 2 or 3 years later to participate in another program? That's a sign that your programs are successful. And if I was an intervener, I'd be saying at the beginning of every process, what do you know about repeat customers? How many customers do you have that were satisfied and came back the next time? That's an indication of good programming, both implementation and feedback. You should talk about whether there's going to be any interim EM&V results or feedback available during the cycle. And then an important point is the portfolio budget, once it's finally set, should include some funds to complete whatever market research and evaluation of programs that people within the portfolio process have decided is needed. And I think that should happen within the process, not after the process, because often after the process people are no longer interested in the topic, and there's a legitimate need, but it doesn't get funded because it wasn't brought up in time. Okay, next slide. Now we're going to talk a little bit about best practices, and this is my attempt to visually summarize that the best practices is that everybody should have their hand on the elephant and understand their role in bringing that particular elephant to fruition. You know, in this case, it's a soccer ball. And next slide. Okay, here's another daunting list of things that I'm not going to read for you, but I wanted to use this as this is a summary of the best practices that we identified when we surveyed all of the portfolio development processes that we could find in 10 to 15 states across North America, and that were identified as being leaders in the field. If you want to go into great detail, there's a source down at the bottom here, and we're going to give you, after this presentation, a link to resources, so you can just click and find it, bring it up in your browser and look through this at your convenience. I think the main summary point that I want to drive here is it's important to know who the stakeholders are, to make sure that there's processes designed so that they can effectively provide input, and that there's feedback where the administrators say, okay, I've heard this, I'm making these changes or I'm not making those changes. And you need to try to build those feedback loops in at every chance you get, to make sure that you don't have people that are funded to go off and do something and they never communicate back to the people who are actually implementing the programs. Next slide coming up. Okay, I was asked to sort of talk about, well, what are the best practices for seeking intervener input? And here's 5 that I've seen, and I'm going to comment a little bit on the strengths and the weaknesses as I go through them. The first one is there are public utility commissions or agencies that say, well, we're going to set up an advisory group. And the purpose of that advisory group is to bring interveners and any other people who are interested in this process to formally comment on whatever the utility sends in as their portfolio plan. and they say, we agreed with these things, but we disagreed with those things. And usually that advisory group report is filed either simultaneously or maybe a week after, whenever the utility files its particular plan. I think this is good in many ways because it gives interveners access to the decision makers, because they read these reports and they say, okay, where do people disagree? The cons are that there's many utility administrators don't like this process because there's multiple masters problem. They don't know whether they should be responding to the decision makers at the PUC or to some very erudite and well-reasoned intervener from EDF who says you should do that, this, that, and the other thing. And so they're not sure which set of masters they should be listening to, so to speak, and who's making the final decision. And there may also be problems with ownership. If an advisory group strongly says, we think it's very important to have a microwave dryer program, and the commission says, we agree, and they order the utility to do that, the utility may feel like they really don't own that program, and they're not going to try really hard to make that program a success. So that's sort of the downside of an advisory group process. Another thing that I would encourage interveners to think about is becoming a shadow member of a program development team at the utility itself. And in this case, basically it says, look, if you're really interested in this set of programs, why don't you sit through our process or some portions of our process and give us input outside of the glare of a public workshop or a public hearing process, and you may be more effective in sort of getting the changes that you want by working, sort of inside the tent on a development team as opposed to outside the tent throwing suggestions or rocks at the utility, depending on your perspective as the time goes on. The third possible best practice is there's collaborative group decisions where you as an intervener have a seat at the table, and your consensus agreement has to be reached before something gets released. And so you have lots of leverage in that particular process. The problem, as I mentioned before, with that is many interveners don't have that much time to sit through 6 months of a collaborative process and try to influence things. And if you've got limited resources, that collaborative process may end up not being worth your while. The other best practice that I've seen is there's targeted testimony or public comment. And what I mean by that is the commission reaches out to a particular set of interveners and says, we want you to comment on this specific portion of the utility portfolio planning. Like, what do you think about what they did with residential lighting and HVAC programs, or how do you think they're doing in terms of equity? The con of that is that testimony usually is pretty one-sided and it's not conducive to compromise. Once it's out there, you sort of set, concrete, and you may set up a situation where the administrators are inherently at conflict with the interveners, regardless of the merits of the situation. And then the summary I would make is that any of these I think are possible, but again, you want to make sure that the loop is closed. When you make a comment, you want to make sure that there's some process, either just over the phone or in writing, that you're going to get a response back from the program administrator. I can't tell you how many calls I used to get when I was involved in these processes from interveners saying, I made all these comments and I'm not hearing anything back from the program administrator. I need to get some response. So it's important to set that up if you can. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about strategic, when and where should I intervene? Particularly if everything, there's just so much paper on my desk, I can't really tell, which is the most important process, or where should I intervene in the process. Okay, so I've identified 7 stages here where you could intervene, and hopefully you'll be able to tell from the schedule that's set out for portfolio development where, and when these things are happening. Obviously, the earlier in this process you intervene, potentially the higher benefit you might get. There's always this process at the beginning of balancing policy priorities. What's more important: cost effectiveness, equity, overall savings, et cetera. Then there's usually stage 2 after you've agreed on the policy priorities. How are you going to brainstorm new ideas? How receptive are they going to be for someone to bring in a completely new program on a template and say, I want you to fund this program, that sort of thing. The other thing that I think is usually there's a process where after the overall budget is set and there's some kind of process to make sure the program administrators are motivated, whether they're performance incentives or whatever, is there's usually a program description template that's available, and we'll give you some examples of those, that allows any party, including interveners, to say, if I'm willing to do the homework and come out with a program concept and some estimate of costs and savings, fill this out, bring it in, and the utility will look that over and decide whether they can incorporate it into their process. After that sort of brainstorming and program description, there's stage 5 is, okay, now let's decide what we're actually going to propose. You know, what mix of programs, dollars, and savings. That's stage 5. And then there's what I call the refinements to program design, and often this is where, you know, interveners and the public are let in at stage 6 as opposed to being let in stage 1 through 5, which, okay, here's a set of program designs, comment on those and change them at the margin. Obviously, you don't have as much leverage there if you wait till stage 6. And stage 7 is, I think, the last refuge of scoundrels. If there's a whole portfolio and you haven't been involved in the process from the beginning, then you have a chance to sort of make comments. But obviously, it's difficult to get people to make changes at that late stage. So I would advise against waiting till stage 7 if at all possible. Next slide coming up. So here's my guide to sort of what's a successful intervention. And again, it depends on what kind of a process you're in. If there's an internal process where you're basically working with the program administration organization on a one-to-one basis and there's not a lot of public comment, the key is making sure that you've developed trust and access to the decision makers. So even if you disagree with whatever the program administrator puts out, you'll be able to make your case in that process with decision makers. And trust, I can't emphasize how important that is. Utilities in general are willing to work with people as long as they can trust them not to renege on agreements or surprise them in public or whatever. So if you can build up that trust, you're going to have a lot more chances for success in an internal process. In an external process, the dynamic is a little bit different. You're in a public meeting, and here it's important to have staff that have good public speaking skills and access to the public staff. They can call them up and say, gee, I wasn't able to really say all the things that I wanted to at the public workshop. Can we talk about this a little bit some more? So there, I think it's important that you sort of have more of an outwardly focused process. And now, if you're in a collaborative process, and what's the keys for success there? I think it's access to experts, because often collaboratives are sort of clogged up with lots of people who at least think they're experts in various topics. And you need to be able to talk in their lingo. And for example, you need to understand the differences between the TRC test and the RIM test and the societal test and a variety of other things, a lot of terms that are sort of arcane that you need to understand before you can be successful in that process. And then obviously you need good compromise skills to be successful in a collaborative process and know when to fight and when to go along. Next slide. Okay, here's just a review of different types of success metrics. Remember I said before, it's important that everybody in the process agrees on how they're going to measure success after the portfolio is done. And here's just a sampling of usually what regulators want, what administrators want, what the designers want, what the evaluators want. And I'm going to ask at the end of this process what the advocates want and ask you to type in your little message box, type in some things of what would be a successful metric for you, and that will help us in terms of structuring our our process later on. So, I think this is pretty self-explanatory. Regulators focus on the bottom line, reported or verified savings and net benefits. Administrators, they're not so worried about that high level. They want to make sure that they got some kind of verification that there was an installation that was successful, and some kind of tracking of that so they can support their performance payments for whatever level of savings they're reporting, and an auditable tracking system, because often public utility commissions want to go back and audit things, so they need to make sure that that's part of their success metric, is that their tracking system works. Designers, obviously, they want evidence that they've proposed various program theories about how people are going to respond to their programs, and they've postulated certain market barriers. They want, for a success metric for them, evidence to come back to them of, were these theories successful, to what extent were these barriers real, and what fraction of the market actually participated in the design that I put out there. And evaluators tend to want some kind of indicator that results in the confidence in the forecast of future program savings. One indicator is the realization rate. That's the fraction of what you actually got versus what you divided by what you forecast. And they want some kind of tracking to do billing analysis so that they can see what the net trends are in that particular market. Okay, so advocates, if you want to, type into the box there what kind of success metric you would like to see for a portfolio, how you measure success in terms of whether a portfolio of energy efficiency programs was successful or not, and we'll look at those later. Okay, and here's some specific examples of success metrics that have been adopted throughout North America. Energy and peak savings, benefit cost tests, levelized program cost tests. One that was pioneered in California and I think a couple of places also in the Northeast. You know, it's a good thing to show people what was the average savings on a customer bill in a particular sector. You know, 5%, 3%. That's a pretty realistic metric that policymakers can respond to. And so those four at the top of there in blue, I recommend that you try to have something like that in every portfolio as a success metric. And then the last ones here are ones that I think are sort of optional, and it goes to everything from fraction of customer classes served to evidence of market transformation. There might be some high-level goals. You may have heard, like, for example, California has this high-level goal. We want to have 10 million solar roofs by 2020 or 25% reduction overall in HVAC use. And we've talked about these other ones before. There's GHG emission reduction goals, private dollars leverage, those types of are other possible success metrics. Okay, now we're going to talk, we've talked about portfolio planning. Now I'm going to try to focus in on for a specific program. If people are, you know, let's say, for example, you really want to promote the use of LED television sets and you want to design a program that way. This is a typical planning process that are used by administrators. And I would say that if you want to be involved as an intervener, it's usually important to participate in boxes 1 and 2 here, the gathering input and developing the conceptual design. After that, you know, feedback, you can obviously give feedback, but you have more leverage if you can get involved in steps 1 and 2. Really, the program administrator takes it from there and when going for 3, 4, and 5 because they're responsible ultimately for step 5, which is completing the program plans and adding the goals, budgets, and marketing strategies. Okay. Here's my sort of perspective on what types of interventions are successful at the program level. In my experience, advocates have been very successful in trying to make the case for new technologies to be supported by programs and a sort of a change in marketing from traditional marketing to social marketing. But both of those things require an understanding of how market channels are working in the specific target market and how to work with trade allies and often patience. I always think of Noah Horowitz from the NRDC as a good example of someone who was very patient in the CFL area and worked with lots of manufacturers to make sure that they met the quality goals and that we reduced a lot of problems like flicker. And over time, that was probably one of the most successful interventions, in my view, ever, is making sure that we took a product that was originally pretty clunky back in the early 1980s and even in the early 1990s and went through a systematic process of working with manufacturers, with advocates sitting there, making sure that they got to a product which now I think people perceive is almost equivalent, if not equivalent, to incandescent light. The other thing I would suggest is often a good thing to sort of make your case is do an intervention with a specific key ally and do a demonstration at some site, even at your own office building or wherever you lease, of saying, look, this is a great technology. We'll have the utility monitor the costs and benefits, and then we'll use it. We'll have a public press release and talk about here's a successful example of how we were able to reduce energy use by X at this particular place. There's other advocates that have made their living over the worry that utilities are wasting money on rebates, and if you want to get involved in that sphere, you can do a lot of research on net to gross methods and trying to make sure that we're not overpaying. So that's another place where I've seen advocates be successful. And then I think advocates have been very successful in shifting dollars to underserved sectors that don't sort of make the utilities initial screen. And that's true, I think, in both low income as well as outreaches to rural areas as opposed to concentrate on urban areas where it's easier to reach customers because of their density. And I would say CFLs is a good case study where there's been interventions that have been useful on both sides, both in terms of promoting the programs and dropping the price, as well as making sure that there's a reasonable balance between CFLs and all of the other types of measures on the residential side that also need to be promoted. Okay, so here's the components of a program plan. You know, if you're ever involved in developing a program plan, you should make sure that it has at least these 8 things. Obviously, a description of the program. What's the value proposition? Why do you think customers are actually going to want to be in this program? What are they going to get out of it? Is it real? Is it tangible? Whatever your customer and trade ally targets are, what fraction of the customers you want to reach, and which trade allies you want to work for. There has to be a listing of what measures are eligible for the program, what particular market barriers do you perceive are out there, and what strategies will be used to address them. What about you know, the incentive or motivation strategy? How are you going to catch customers' attention? What are the process steps that people have to go to so quote qualify and to actually participate in the program? Description of marketing and promotional materials, and then some kind of budget and schedule with quantitative goals. There's an example template that's posted on the route site that we're going to get you at the end of this process. Next slide. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about risks. We don't want to be eaten by the hippopotamus. We don't want to go out and say that we're going to achieve 100 megawatts and then find out that we only got to 33 megawatts at the end of the day. So how can we mitigate the risks that we run when we're firmly behind a portfolio that's going to achieve a certain amount of savings? How do we make sure that it's going to happen? Next slide. So here's my experience on the biggest risk to portfolio success. The first one is overestimates of gross savings due to faulty baselines, and you get some pesky evaluator coming in at the end of the day saying, well, you know, they assumed that the baseline was this, but my market research says that the current practices is the baseline is 30% below that, so instead of having savings of 5% at a particular customer site, we're only going to claim 1% or something like that. So there's often a systematic bias in gross savings, and you should look carefully at that. The second risk is you hire some set of evaluators, and you've gone in and said the net to gross ratio is going to be 90% or 80%. You know, in other words, only 10% of the customers are going to be quote unquote free riders, and there's not going to be very significant market effects. And then there's a moving baseline, and there's large-scale market adoption of the product, and there's a big net to gross adjustment that takes the savings from 10 megawatts to 5 megawatts after you adjust for this estimate of free riders. So what you should take from that is you should be very clear going in about when are there going to be net to gross measurements or studies done, how will they be used to adjust the program's savings goals. Is it going to be retrospective or prospective? All those things need to be worked out in advance. The third risk that I've seen in terms of portfolio success, I mentioned a little bit earlier, is you get very low levels of customer participation because the market tanks. There's either a program design problem or there's a slow economy and you just can't reach out to that particular sector. And then the final risk, which I think is most prevalent in California, is that you have performance incentives that induce warlike behavior between defenders of the rate base and greedy administrators. And people lose sight of the fact that they're trying to save energy, and they get into a personality battle of, is it fair to give the utilities $5 million, or is it only fair to give them $1 million in performance incentives or penalties? And so people just get so caught up in this battle over dollars that they lose sight of the goal, which should be to reduce energy use in society as a whole. So I would caution people that when you get involved in that war, try to step back occasionally. Even though people have strongly felt opinions, you often are going to lose the war because you get involved in this battle of performance incentives. Next slide. So here's a suggested process for understanding the risks of non-performance, and this is pretty simple. List all the factors in these various program savings and participation forecasts that are likely to vary significantly or be uncertain. And there's, people can pick up Monte Carlo analysis tools. They're available for cheap off the web to understand what the key inputs are that drive these savings or cost-effectiveness outcomes. What you do is you basically specify, well, here's what we think the program savings forecast is, and here's what the distribution is. Here's the, 90% of the time it's going to be at this level, 10% of the time it's going to be that level. And if you do that systematically enough, you can figure out, well, what are the key assumptions that we made here that are likely to affect the probability that our portfolio will actually reach its net savings targets. And the key drivers that I found are participation forecasts, the net to gross ex ante assumption, the realization rate, fraction of the savings are you going to get versus what your forecast is, and is the program design acceptable to trade allies and others? Okay, getting close to the end here. Here's just an example of one Monte Carlo simulation that was done in California, where they did, they took a whole portfolio, they looked at all of the parameters that went in, they specified confidence intervals around each of those forecasts, and they said, okay, well, what's most likely to lead to variance in terms of our expected outcome of program savings? And in this particular case, the net to gross adjustments accounted for 62% of the variance in all the Monte Carlo simulations, which suggests to program administrators and advocates alike, we need to really concentrate on that because that's the one that's most likely to trip us up. Installation risk was lower, amount of the variance is only 24%, and the estimate of ex-ante gross savings per unit risk was even the lower overall. Only 13% of the variance was attributable to that particular variable. So here's some strategies to mitigate the risks of achieving savings goals and feeling embarrassed if your portfolio doesn't get to where you wanted it to be. One is that's been used successfully by program administrators is they freeze the net to gross ratios. They say, look, we're going to agree on this net to gross ratio of 0.8 for the next 3 years, and when we get the evaluations, we're only going to use the evaluation to change that prospectively into the future. Another strategy is to transfer some of the installation and net to gross risk to third parties through contracts. And you say, look, we're only going to pay you X amount, and we're going to ding you if the net to gross ratio turns out to be less than 70%. So you need to work with your customers to make sure that they're true program participants and that they weren't going to do it anyways in the absence of the program. Another strategy to mitigate risk is to bound the expected variation in gross or net savings by agreeing that you're not going to make more than a 10% change or a 15% change to any particular set of variables, and that's another way of bounding your risk. This is one that hasn't been explored very much, but I think it's important. Diversifying the delivery mechanisms. There are certain programs that work regardless of the economic cycle, and there's others that are highly dependent on the economic cycle. So you want to make sure that you have a mix of both. For example, retrofit programs that deal with light bulbs are pretty impervious to economic cycles. People will continue to need to replace light bulbs over time. But new construction programs, on the other hand, have lots of risk because they're predicated on forecasts of new construction starts, which may or may not happen depending on where you are in the overall cycle of the economy. The other thing you should do, and I think this is important, is you should diversify your performance incentive mechanisms. Many people design one mechanism and it's all predicated on a certain set of measurements, and if that goes south, there's nothing left. So I think the best practice is you should have a mechanism that's designed to reward people for just doing things like spending their program dollars and reaching a certain level of customers, and having that be some percentage of the overall performance payment, and then having another percentage be involved in a more complicated measurements of net benefits produced by the program. So you've diversified your risk. If one mechanism doesn't work, you've at least sent some signal for mechanisms that are tried and true. Okay, I'm getting close to the end of my time. Okay, so this is the next to the last slide. Deciding how and where to make a difference is important. This is basically a summary of what I've talked about over the previous 30 or so slides. Review the roles and responsibilities of people who are in the portfolio development process and look for gaps that you might be able to fill. Try to match the strengths of your advocacy organization to the perceived weaknesses in the existing portfolio or policy development. If at all possible, review the lessons learned from the last portfolio exercise. Go back and interview the administrators or see if there's a written record so you can learn those lessons. Work with researchers to gather the market data that may be necessary to make your case. If you're interested in intervening on, about HVAC systems, then you should talk with some people who know something about the HVAC market. And look for synergies with other programs and try to identify program champions who can be held up as role models within the process. And I know that's sometimes difficult, but often there is a program administrator person who was successful in developing a program, and people have respect for that person, so you can bring them in and use that as a way of convincing people of the adequacy of your case. And finally, my advice to people in portfolio development is slow and steady wins the race almost every time. People who come in and try to make dramatic statements in one particular hearing about, a particular program or a particular approach, and then they vanish from the process, they don't have very much effect. It's people who are there from the beginning, who are slow and measured and listen first, and then make their case. They tend to be the most successful. So finally, interveners can make a significant difference in the outcomes of portfolio planning processes if they think strategically and do their homework. Choosing where and when to intervene is a crucial decision. You need to understand something about the time it's going to take, the resources, and the risk of success. Your strategy should obviously be guided by what's most important to your organization. Do you have environmental goals, equity goals, or efficiency goals? And you should be clear about that. Processes are becoming fairly sophisticated in many states, and the costs of entry as a result are high and not reimbursable in some cases. So if you don't understand how the game is played in the jurisdiction of interest, don't burn yourself by participating and spending a lot of money and not being effective at the process. Understand what you're going into, if at all possible. Okay, so that concludes my quick tour through portfolio development processes. I just want to let you know that a lot of the information that I've talked about is available. We're going to give you a resources slide at the end of the day that tells you exactly where to go to find more information about both the templates for portfolio planning, for program planning, and the best practices study. And with that, I want to sort of open it up for questions. And
thanks, Mike. Mike, this is Steve Schiller. Hi, everybody. Some folks have been typing in questions into the message box. Just sort of give folks a time check. We're approximately halfway through. We're going to set aside some time here for folks to ask questions of Mike and to do that through typing in through the message box. We've got a couple questions already. We're then going to turn to the evaluation presentation, which I will be doing. And then we'll leave a little, and we're hoping to have 20, 30 minutes at the end of this time frame for more of a general discussion about the portfolio planning and evaluation. Also, just as a reminder, the presentations and all are being recorded, and I believe will be available on the RAP site. Also, as Mike indicated, we're going to be, all the presentations are up on the web, on the RAP website, as well as the references we've indicated. And there will also be a quick survey at the end of the presentation, so just sort of a reminder now for folks, if they could take a couple minutes at the end of the presentation and just respond to some feedback questions that will come up automatically at the end of the webinar at 4 o'clock Eastern Time. So Mike, I've been sort of watching the questions that have come in, and it seems like most of them so far have been related around setting objectives. And I don't know if you want to talk a little more about that. In particular, seeing folks indicate what they see as the most important objectives. And one particular question around leveraging program dollars with private investment, in the concept that, does that make sense as a goal? How would you actually achieve that? How would you determine if you've met your goal?
Okay, so that's a good question. If you're going to try to leverage private dollars, first of all, you have to design programs that are likely to achieve that effect, and then you have to figure out some way of measuring that. I think the best way to measure that is first you need to set up some kind of mechanism that's tracking, well, what's the baseline share of the efficient product in the marketplace? So you need to do some kind of baseline study that says, currently, I'm going to make a guess here, 30% of the customers buy CFLs when they go to their store or big box outlet. And your goal might be to increase that to 50% over 3 years. And in charge of trying to figure out what the leverage is, you figure out, first of all, what amount of public dollars went to try to achieve that effect. And then after the fact, you look at, okay, so if $1 million went to achieving an effect, and that $1 million we can trace to so many CFLs that took us from, let's say, 30 to 40, and then if we can confirm that our goal was made by doing another market study to figure out what percentage of the customers are buying CFLs 3 years from now, and that's gone up to 50, then the leverage dollars is that other 10% of the market that bought these things on their own without the benefit of any kind of program intervention. The difficulty in doing that is It's pretty easy to do for certain types of big ticket items like more efficient air conditioning systems or more efficient furnaces or that type of thing. If you're working with a consumer product that are bought frequently, like light bulbs, and you're intervening on the upstream side, it's more difficult to figure out what private leverage there is, because it's difficult to define what's a program bulb and what's a non-program bulb. So, basically what you're trying to do is convince administrators to set up a tracking mechanism where they can minimize the fraction of the money that they have to pay out in a rebate and maximize the amount that the developer or the customer pays on their own. And you can set leverage ratios and say, well, last year we had a leverage ratio of 1.5 to 1 and we want to try to get to 2 to 1. As you can tell, it requires more measurement, so it's more difficult to achieve. And you may be able to back into this leverage estimate just doing traditional energy savings. But in some jurisdictions, it's important, like, for example, my experiences in Texas. In Texas, they really want to see how much leverage there was in the private sector, so they've tried to construct those kind of metrics. Did that answer your question? If not, just type back in, and I'll look at this issue again.
Yeah, Mike, and I think part of that question might have been too as to whether that's a reasonable goal or not. And at least for myself, given what our long-term or short-term, medium-term goals are for efficiency, reaching towards, say, a 80% greenhouse gas reduction, it's going to take private money. There is not enough money in the government treasuries or in the ratepayer selected funds to not only pay for the cost of all these activities, but to leverage them up and try to transform a market so that when the markets become transformed, almost by definition, it becomes private sector money. So to me, it's a critical requirement that you get the private sector to provide the money, whether that's through the end-use customers funds, whether it's commercial, residential, industrial customers, or through leveraging with financial mechanisms. We're just not going to get where we need to go without the private sector funding. And if that's recognized, that becomes a goal, and if it becomes a goal, we need to establish the metrics, and that's what Mike was referring to, I think.
Yeah. So I'm scrolling through the other questions. One question here is from Seth Nowak is doing homework equal to doing a scoping study? Read slide 17. So I'm going to have to go back and look what slide 17 is. But what I mean by doing homework is trying to have an understanding of how big the potential market is for a particular program and bringing that to the portfolio development process at the beginning rather than at the end of the process. So in my mind, for example, a good example of homework is a utility program administrator on the first day would say, okay, we have 2 million households in our service territory, and our research suggests to us that we've reached 200,000 of those. So we've achieved 10% participation. And our research also shows that most of them are dealing with measures that have to do with either appliance replacement or CFLs. And we haven't been very successful in reaching out to customers and getting them to do things like improving the integrity of their shell through insulation or various kinds of new window treatments. And we haven't had much success in the so-called whole house doctoring approach. So you've given an overview of what's happened in the past 2 or 3 years. And that's the homework, the basis that people need to think from, okay, now what can we do in the future given this history of success and or failure in reaching certain markets? What makes sense to do going forward? And I'm just trying to suggest that it's important to do that homework before you start, rather than running into problems where an intervener says, well, I think it would be great if we had a program that dealt with clothes washers, because that's a very significant portion of energy use, and we think that we can achieve a 50% reduction. And someone turns to the administrator and says, well, what fraction of your households have clothes washers? And they say, well, we don't know, right? You want to avoid those kinds of pregnant pauses in these discussions. So to do your homework, you have to have a good idea of what the existing market structure looks like, and what fraction of customers have what particular energy-using devices. So, Steph, if that answered your question, let me know. If not, just type in another question and I'll come back to it. So, Steve, are there other questions I should handle, or should we jump to your presentation?
Mike, I didn't actually see others there, it's actually, we're actually be right on time if we jump to my presentation.
Wonderful. That's what we'll do. So thank you, everybody, for listening in, and I hope we have more questions after we get through listening to Steve.
Yeah, and folks can be thinking about that, again, typing them into the messages or holding them, and we should have about a half an hour at the end of my presentation to have a broader discussion if people would like. So I guess good morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're at. And again, I'm Steve Schiller, and I'm going to be talking about the evaluation, measurement, and verification of energy efficiency programs and portfolios. So with that, let me get started here. And see if we can get the slides to go forward. There we go, I think. Maybe. Maybe not. There we go. So first, before I get into talking about EM&V, I want to provide a little bit of context and perhaps transition from Mike's discussion about building portfolios, in that I look at this in our efforts that we're all working on together is to, this continuum of activity where in some ways it starts with developing new technologies, the RD&D, trying to push innovation, and then we deploy programs, projects, activities, and what we're really looking for in many ways is to transform markets, either to have efficiency just part of standard practice and or as part of a regulatory requirement through codes and standards. And I look at our goal is to accelerate this process and to keep it moving forward. And with respect to EM&V in this, as much of a pain as it can sometimes seem, I like to look at it as an activity that can be in supporting of this goal, in that it's a resource, it's not a barrier. So in terms of this particular presentation, what I want to do is several things. One is provide sort of a basic working knowledge, and that will be the first part of the presentation about what is evaluation. And then I'm going to talk about some of the key issues that come up in terms of defining EM&V. The basis of this is really to be thinking about evaluation really as a risk management. Throughout this, I'll be talking about, and you'll see that it really comes down to questions of balancing the cost of providing the information through EM&V and getting the value of information. And in many ways, it's just down to how good is good enough. And as you go through and listen to the presentation, you'll see quite a few issues. And so one of the things that you might want to be considering as you're looking at this is what are the most important issues around evaluation that you want to provide input and guidance on. So starting with an EM&V overview, I'm going to provide some basic definitions and understanding of that. Starting with this pyramid on the right, and Mike touched on this, is that when we look at how we define efficiency activities, it really starts with the measures. These are the replacing the light bulbs, the heating system improvement, the insulation, the industrial process, and that builds up to a number of measures to be projects. Projects tend to take place, say, in a single facility, a home or a commercial building, et cetera. And those projects build up into a program, and then the program builds up into a portfolio of programs, say across a utility or a state or even just across the market sector. And when we look at evaluation, it typically within this country, actually worldwide, is what we call a bottom-up process, is that we build up the savings from the measures to the projects to the programs to the portfolio. And that's the way we generally look at EM&V. Now, in many ways, what we're really looking for is what is the energy consumption reduction within a whole sector or a state or a region or the country or the planet or the universe. And so what we're trying to achieve is an actual reduction in energy consumption. So we have all these portfolios that are taking place within the sector. And so in some ways we want to take a look at a top-down analysis to see if we can detect the energy savings that are taking place and actually be able to allocate which of those are taking place due to the efficiency actions. Having said that, virtually all the evaluations that are done, like I mentioned, are from a bottom-up point of view. But I want folks to be aware of the concepts of a top-down, even though we'll be talking, or at least I'll be only talking about bottom-up in this presentation. So in terms of definitions, three key terms. One is evaluation, then measurement and verification. Evaluation is really looking at what's happening on a program or portfolio basis, and this is why I put that pyramid on before, is to talk about evaluations looking at what's happening at a sort of a broader level, whereas M&V, measurement and verification, is really about looking at individual measures or sites or projects. And that can be a subset of the program evaluation, as I'll talk about in a little bit. And then people hear this term, EM&V. It's really a catch-all for evaluation, measurement, and verification. Sometimes people replace the M with monitoring. What we're trying to do with the industry is try to get these questions for everybody to be used. And I just saw a note come in with loss of audio from one person. Mike, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not sure what's happening for us. Hopefully, maybe you can dial back in. Of course, my saying that if you can't hear me doesn't mean anything, does it?
Well, if anyone else is having a problem, you should go ahead and type in the message. And there's a telephone number that you can call at the beginning of the presentation. It's 802-223-8199 if you're having trouble with your audio.
Yeah, but they're not going to. Yeah, you might want to type that into the box. Maybe just retype in the original call-in number.
Okay.
So, anyways, back in the presentation here. So, as we look at evaluation, people tend to break it into two sort of overarching categories. One is formative and the other is outcomes. I'm an engineer. I think like an engineer, for better or for worse. A lot of evaluation theory and practice really comes from the social sciences historically, looking at things like evaluating the performance in education programs. And this is what definitions come out of this is formative, which is trying to help program design, looking at how programs are operating, and then outcomes, which are what we're more used to when people think about is determining program results. And they're often mixed and matched. Hopefully, here we go, the next slide here, you'll have the formative and the outcome. So I'm going to talk primarily about impact evaluation, which is a form of the outcome evaluation, seeing what the actual impacts are, what the savings are, energy savings, for example. Some of the other formative ones, if I have time, I'll talk a bit about process evaluation, market assessments. In the evaluation package that you'll see on the RAP website, at the end of the presentation are slides about process market evaluations. And so even though I'm primarily going to talk about impact, there's that information available in the packets that you will be able to download from the web. So, first question, why am I doing this? So there's really two reasons. One is quantifying the results. This is the one most people think of, I think, in terms of regulatory requirements. You know, was the ratepayer money properly spent? Was the public money spent appropriately? Did you get the right value for the dollars invested? You know, what were the actual savings? So that's a primary purpose of evaluation. But the other primary purpose is trying to understand why these effects took place and to make things better, you know, based on that concept that things that are measured tend to improve. So when we're doing work, we try to think about both of these. The issues that you'll see come down to a couple that I try to list here in this introductory slide. One is, and the first point I make is that a lot of them flow from the fact that basically you can't measure savings. you're essentially trying to measure what didn't happen, and there's nothing to measure. It's always an estimate. No matter what you're doing with efficiency, you're comparing what you have now with what you think you would have had if you hadn't done the activity. So you're always working with an estimate. And so EM&V tends to be about this risk management, as I mentioned before. It's, what is the risk associated with not getting the number right? How important is it to document the savings? And therefore, when you're looking at this risk management and dealing with an estimate, I always think it comes down to these two questions highlighted in green at the bottom here, which is, well, how good is good enough? And as compared to what? As compared to supply resource, as compared to what would have happened, as compared to if you didn't do anything at all, even if you're unsure about what the result was. So what I find, and maybe perhaps because I'm an annoying engineer, is that I tend, when talking about setting up evaluation infrastructures, is to talk about what they're going to be using the information for, how important is it, how good is good enough, and what are they using it for, as compared to what alternatives. So now, as I mentioned, I'm going to talk primarily about impact evaluation. I'm going to try to do a quick run-through about what is impact evaluation to help inform the discussion about the issues. So the basics of impact evaluation is that it's used to determine the directly achieved program benefits, energy and demand savings, but also potentially co-benefits such as environmental improvement, greenhouse gas reduction. And as I mentioned before, it's attempting to measure what didn't happen. So the fundamental equation is impact equals the actual, what you see as energy consumption or demand or emissions today, versus projected as to what it would have occurred in the absence of the activity, plus all those adjustments, like the weather's different. This is our fundamental approach that we do, and hopefully when this, one more slide ahead. So some of the things that affect energy efficiency or the consumption of energy other than just, the energy efficiency measure, which is what we're trying to control for, is things that might occur within the individual facility, such as the occupancy rate in a commercial building, whether the number of shifts changed in an industrial facility, whether the demographics of the people in the household changed, the teenagers went off to college. And then little tiny broader issues, which I say cynically, which things like weather, the economy, energy prices, other programs taking place, all things that can affect energy consumption. And what we're trying to do with the impact evaluation is isolate out what are the effects that were actually due to the efficiency that we're funding. So this chart here, and I'm going to take my first shot at trying to use a marker tool here. Let's see if this works. So what this graph is sort of, in some ways, summarizes everything you need to know about impact evaluation, in that what this is showing here is, let's see if this works. No, let's see here. A little marker. There we go. So what we're showing here in my horrible drawing skills here is energy consumption probably of a commercial building with an air conditioning load going along, and then over here we have the implementation that takes place, and hopefully the energy consumption goes down. As you can see, it looks kind of lower than what it was before. And the entire evaluation activity is all about trying to figure out what this red line is. This is what would have occurred in the baseline in the absence of the activity. So whether you're doing deemed savings values or fancy computer models, you're always just really trying to figure out what the energy consumption would have been, what the baseline would have been during this reporting period, and the difference is the shaded area here. So in some ways, as I mentioned just before, all evaluation comes down to figuring out what that red line is. Okay, this chart here is just put in to sort of mention that another thing that's an objective associated with evaluation is using the results from evaluation to project into the future, not just on an individual building or program portfolio, but looking at what the needs are associated with generation and transmission distribution requirements. And that's all I really wanted to get across in this chart, is another objective here associated with having good evaluation results. Next slide. So with that, as I mentioned, the baselines are a critical aspect of this. There's a couple of different ways that we define baselines. One way to break them out is between project-specific and performance standard baselines. Project-specific is looking at individual measures or projects and saying, what's going on in that facility. The performance basis is looking at it from a much broader point of view, and you might be looking at, say, what's common practice or what's code and standards requirements. We'll talk about that in the issues category as to what are ways to do this. And I just want to mention the last point on the bottom here about dynamic baselines is that a baseline is not always the same throughout the life of a measure. Codes and standards, common practice, the existing equipment would have failed, what it would have been replaced with. Slide movement's a little slow here. So the results that we report from impact evaluations are gross savings and net savings. Gross savings being those directly from the program promoted actions. They're done by the program participants regardless of the extent or the nature of their influence on their actions of the program. Net savings is trying to break out those portions of the gross savings that are actually attributable to the program. We'll talk about this later in the issues section of the presentation, but gross savings and net savings have different uses when you're looking at performance of systems. And then the co-benefits, like I mentioned, things such as emission reductions. Next slide. Two components to the impact evaluation. One is verifying the potential to generate savings. The other is actually determining the savings. So in some programs and some activities, it might be perfectly satisfactory to just confirm that the right stuff was installed and it's operating properly. If you switch out a 60-watt light bulb for a 13-watt light bulb, guess what? You're going to save energy as long as that light is turned on at some point. So in some ways, perhaps using deemed savings values, you find that a lot of programs are satisfied with just verifying the potential to generate savings versus going through and doing the determination of savings. Often that verification is significantly less expensive, and back to that trading off, how good is good enough, you might find that be satisfactory. Another general issue is around persistence, and this is looking at the savings not only during the first year, which tends to be what a lot of people think about when they're doing up numbers, but looking at how the performance changes during the measure's life, which can be 5, 10, 15, 20 years or longer. And we use this term effective useful life as a way to describe the persistence. But again, one of the important issues for people to think about is not only, it's not just the first year savings, we're counting economic benefits when we're doing cost effectiveness over a life of a measure. How are we actually determining that? How are we actually verifying it over time? Okay, getting into the approaches for determining gross energy savings, which, as I mentioned before, are the savings that take place irrespective of the cause of those by the participants. Three basic approaches: deemed savings, many of you are probably familiar with, essentially a fixed number, hopefully based on real data. We also can have an approach that's used called deemed calculated savings, which is a standard equation that deemed and perhaps some field data is plugged into. Statistical analysis of a large volume of energy data. This is essentially used for programs that involve, say, hundreds or thousands of, say, residential homes that are retrofitted, and you compare the energy performance in real time with the participants in a program and the non-participants. And then the measurement and verification approaches. These come from this document called the International Performance Measurement and Verification Protocol. And there's some not terribly creative 4 options there called A, B, C, and D. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. Next set of slides talk a little bit about these different approaches for determining gross savings, the deemed savings approach here. And as I just said, I'm going to go through these quickly, but again, these are all available in the packet, and you go back to them to reference them. What we talk about here is a little more definition of the deemed savings that I just mentioned. Their values tend to be referenced in something called a technical reference manual. A lot of states or regions have these documents, and they basically are a collection of the savings values that have been determined to be reputable and usable. A key aspect of the deemed savings values is that you make sure you use them appropriately, and it comes down to technologies don't save energy it's how they're used that save energy. And I borrowed that from the National Rifle Association. I was trying to figure out something along the lines of relating, pulling a CFL from my cold dead hand, but it didn't quite flow as well. What we're essentially trying to do here with deemed savings values is apply them correctly and making sure that they have applicability conditions so that when you apply, say, the value of a certain lamp replacement, that it's different in a residence versus a commercial building, and you need to make sure you apply them appropriately. Not surprisingly, the basic rules of thumb are you use them when the savings are either very small or the risk associated with the savings, that is, the certainty is quite high. If you have a lot of uncertainty and there are a great deal of savings, you tend not to want to use deemed savings values. The large-scale data analysis approach, as I mentioned, this is essentially trying to do comparison groups in a time series comparison. This next slide here has the only set of equations. I don't have the nice figures that Mike had, but essentially what we have here is a way of doing this, and the best way to do it, if you can come up with a good comparison group, is to do that subdivision that has the program and compare that with a subdivision that doesn't have the program over the same period of time. One of the nice things about that is it takes into account both net and gross effects, because you're also controlling for things such as changes in energy costs. The measurement and verification approaches, these are strictly associated with determining gross energy savings or demand savings. There's two different ways we do this. One is that you take every single project within a program and you come up with the savings associated with that particular project or facility, or potentially you take a representative sample of those projects and determine the savings. And then you apply one of those options that I mentioned from the IPMVP, and you then apply the results of that to the entire program, whether it's a census or a sample of the projects. As I mentioned, the IPMVP, that's the International Performance Measurement and Verification Protocol, has 4 options, A, B, C, and D. A is not necessarily better than D. They're just how it was named. And each one has their own little approaches for determining savings. The IPMVP has been around for close to 20 years now. It's used in many, many countries. It's downloaded off the website that it's at, and that'll be one of the references we provide thousands of times a year. So it seems to be the accepted source for at least how we define these. And generally speaking, from a top-level look at these M&V options, you have ones such as A and B, which are retrofit isolation. This is, oh, I'm going to use my little marker again here. This is the case where you do retrofit isolation, is that if you're doing, say, a retrofit on a motor, say with a variable speed drive, options A and B are about just looking at the savings at that motor. And the nice part about that is it gives you something very specific to measure. The options C and D look at the whole facility here, and the nice part about options C and D is that there might actually be, say, a building meter data that you can use, and you take into account any spillover effects associated with that motor retrofit, interactive effects. For example, if you change out a lighting system in a building, you can change the cooling load, reduce the cooling load, or potentially increase the heating load. If you do retrofit isolation, you have to deal with that separately. If you do a whole building approach, you get that combined in there. The difficulty, though, with the whole facility approaches are that if you have a lot of things going on in that building, it's hard to break out what are the actual energy savings due to your measures. Trade-offs, there's not one is particularly better or worse than the other. They're just applicable in different situations. So circling back, we have these different approaches for determining savings. And what might typically be seen is you have set up prescriptive programs, such as, say, a CFL or refrigerator program changeouts. You probably or could use deemed savings values for those. You might have a set of prescriptive programs that are very well defined, say changing out, as I have an example here, of ventilation fans. You have a standard equation. You plug in the value of the motor amperage from the individual projects, and you do that in a deemed calculated way into a standard equation. Other set of custom programs may be taking place in commercial or industrial buildings. You would use a combination of these M&V approaches, each one applicable as needed. And then, say, for that residential comprehensive program, you might use the large-scale data analysis. And you use those and to come up with your overall savings, again, from a bottom-up point of view for your overall portfolio. And just looking at one of the questions, sort of quickly respond here. If you were doing if you were actually interested in the performance of individual measures within a building, say your lighting performance of the lighting measures and the motor measures and the control measures, you'd probably have to use an M&V approach because the whole building approaches are just going to tell you what the overall savings are and not be able to attribute it to individual measures. Sometimes if you use a computer simulation approach, which is option D, the modeling can allow you to see the savings from individual measures. And so that's a possibility. But generally speaking, if you want to know how each individual measure performed, you're talking about an M&V approach. Net energy savings. So when we're looking at net energy savings, again, that's the savings that are actually attributable to the program. You can have savings there that are primarily for the participant, but you might actually have non-participant savings as well. So usually, when we're looking at net energy savings, we tend to look at two main areas. One is those old free riders, those folks who would have done something anyways without the program. Fortunately or unfortunately, though, it's not always really clear-cut as to what a free rider is, and they can be total, partial, or deferred, and I'll talk about that in a second. The other is spillover, and that's either program participants who decided to do even more than they were incented to do from the program. The other aspect is for non-participants, so that's your next-door neighbor who saw that wonderful energy-efficient windows that you put in, and even though the program's no longer available, they decide to do energy-efficient windows themselves. As I mentioned, though, it's not always really straightforward as to what we mean by free riders. This is a table that was used in an evaluation study, an attempt to try to define free ridership. It tends not to be 0 or 1. In this case, what they try to do is say, well, if they had installed, looking at the middle column, for example, where it's the same efficiency, if they perhaps would have put in a project, but it wouldn't have been as high and efficient as a result of the program, that's really kind of a partial free rider. They did something, but they did something, they would have done something, but maybe not as efficient. Another one is deferred. If they would have done a project, but they would have done it 3 years from now. These are all types of things that go into it that make it fairly difficult to actually pull out an exact number. The way we tend to do this, though, with the net savings determination is to do some sort of self-reporting, which is basically just people tell us what they did or why they did it. Enhanced, where you do an interview. There's a variety of different models that can be used to compare participants, non-participants. And then a favorite of many states is just stipulate a number. Why do they do that? Because it's really easy. Last comments on the net to gross. It's really about attribution. This is where California has gotten wrapped around the axle the last year or two, is trying to figure out what are the savings that are attributable to the utility action in the case of California. And this is, there's two things that you're probably interested in this. If you're looking at trying to do, say, a shareholder incentive mechanism, you probably want to only have the, say, utility in that case get credit for the things that they're responsible for, not the fact that the energy prices went up, 50%. The other thing you're trying to do with attribution is try to figure out how to improve your programs. If you have a program with a lot of free ridership, maybe you need to modify your program design. Maybe that indicates that there's some better places to put money. So the attribution issue is not always just about a gotcha for an administrator. It can also be back to that second primary reason I mentioned, which is trying to figure out how to make programs better. Someone had asked a question about how to come up with the net to gross figures determined. only semi-jokingly, I would say that people do lots of detailed analysis and then they make up a number. Historically speaking, people have used net to gross numbers. Mike, you can chime in. Say anywhere from, say, 75% to even 100%, maybe 0.8, 0.9, they're kind of typical numbers. But we've seen from California, based on the definition of the PUC, some net to gross numbers come in much, much lower in the 0.5, 0.4, 0.3 range. So, folks tend to just sort of pick a number. Preferably it's based on some historical information, but in the past it's really just been picking a number. I wish I could say differently. Here, I just want to let you know that the references are on the website, and letting you know that there are a number of different types of documents. As I mentioned, there's technical reference manuals and evaluation protocols. Different types of documents are available in many states. There's a number of efforts taking place around the country to basically improve the practice of evaluation, in some cases trying to improve the consistency. Just list a few here. I won't necessarily go through all these here, but again, the websites and the references are within this packet that you can grab. And a lot of the issues that you're facing as advocates are not new or unique to anybody. You can find these various groups that are working on them as well and trying to find, for example, that balance. One document you might find particularly useful is the Model Energy Efficiency Program Impact Evaluation Guide. We tend not to come up with short or simple names, I guess, within this industry for our document, but this is a product of the National Action Plan for Energy Efficiency. It provides a pretty good overview of the evaluation process and how it takes place, as well as planning. It has a number of examples and references and example materials in there as well. Okay, so that's basically the sort of first half of the presentation I wanted to go through to provide some background. And now, as Mike had done, I think very well, to get into really the issues that you might be facing and seeing in evaluation. So, in some ways you might describe these as technical issues and policy issues. I think for myself, the technical issues are not, terribly controversial. The industry has been doing this for a long time. Certainly from a bottom-up point of view, we know the ways in which to calculate the energy savings. There's a question really of how good is good enough on this, but you don't need to really reinvent the wheel here. It's in terms of what are the ways to do this. And this table here is sort of summarizing the approaches that I mentioned before about how we go through and do a process. So I don't think you will tend to find many issues on the technical side. On the policy side, on the other hand, this whole thing about balancing cost and value of information, attribution, scaling up the efficiency actions in the EM&V, this is really, I think, going to be your focus and what I'm going to focus on for the next half hour here. To the right, this box here is a reference to a report that both Mike and I worked on for Lawrence Berkeley Lab, identifying on a national level some of the broad issues that are across the industry. And again, the reference for the report is available if people want to look at. It's a nice summary of what people are doing for evaluation in about 14 states and regions in the country, and then trying to identify these sort of broad issues. But for individual programs and such, I'm going to go into a different, a more detailed list. It's starting with this slide here. So this slide and the next slide are what I've identified as issues that I think are important for anybody involved in developing or advocating with respect to energy efficiency programs on the EM&V issues. So the first category here are what are the objectives. For the kind of fundamental thing is what's your objectives, and knowing what your objectives are, what are the metrics for determining whether you met those objectives. A part of this is cost effectiveness and trying to find which cost effectiveness tests will be used. And then from a broad way, what kind of evaluation principles are you going to have to drive this effort? Now I have some slides on each of these. Next broad category is the savings. How are you determining savings? So what are the baselines that you're judging this against? Is it existing standards, the codes? Are you going to allow this dynamic baselines over the life of the measures? What are the performance determined on? Is it on net or gross savings? As we look at different states, they report net or gross or both. They use them for different objectives. And if you're going to be doing net savings, how do you define net savings? What's included in that? This is perhaps a bit of a technical issue, but it does get into the policy and supporting the metrics about what the boundary is, how granular do you want the results. What I mean in terms of boundary, one thing here is whether you're going to include transmission distribution savings when you talk about end-use savings, and also how granular. Do you want savings reported on an hourly basis, daily basis, monthly, annual, how much detail you need? And that gets back again to your metrics. It's important to understand what your metrics are that drives what type of data is required and how detailed it's going to be. How are savings applied? Do you just provide estimates in the beginning, what we call ex-ante savings, and that's the basis for performance as long as the stuff is verified to be installed properly? Do you use the information for going forward, the evaluation results, to provide information for building better estimates in the future? Or are you going to be using that information based on the ex post, the after the fact evaluation activities to determine what actual savings were? Next set of issues on this slide here are the approaches. Going through what kind of approaches are going to be used, and how will they be selected. This gets back to those M&V approaches and the deemed savings value. What's your schedule? Very critical aspect. What's the schedule for implementing and the reporting? Data management strategies. How will all this information that's being collected be secure and provided? Will it be transparent? Who will have access to it? And then perhaps the biggest issue, what it all comes down to for many people, is how much money is going to be spent on this and how certain are the results going to be. How are you going to allocate the money between the various types of evaluation activities? And then lastly, who's going to conduct the evaluation? What is independent evaluation? What are the roles between the utilities or utility commission or some third-party group? And if there are disputes in the evaluations, how will they be determined? Or how will they be resolved, even better? So I'm going to try to go through each of these, the next set here, but before I do that, I want to mention, in terms of expectations, I listed a number of issues, and working with this recently in a collaborative group in one of the states, we actually expanded that list of 15 to about 20. So there's a lot of issues there, but sort of coming down to what's manageable. In some ways, it all comes down to what is your expectation for what's going to be an E&V report. When this is all said and done, what are you expecting as an advocate to see in those evaluation reports? What's going to be the scale of that evaluation effort? How much money, but really how rigorous is that going to be done? So when you see those results in the report, what levels of confidence you're going to have that they're the right numbers? And then who's going to be doing the results? Who's going to be doing the evaluations? Who's going to be receiving, reviewing? What's the process for ongoing engagement in dispute resolution? And then lastly, what are you going to do with those results? So you get a nice report. Is it just going to sit on the shelf, or is it actually going to be applied in a productive manner? So those are the primary things, I think, from all these issues. So in terms of looking at this, also this sort of fits within the planning process. And Mike had a similar chart to this. This is about as confusing as you ever want to get. What we're trying to show with this is that, it's really a cyclical process here where you're working on developing programs with your policy objectives, and you're doing your planning, your program objectives, and it just sort of works in this circle of coming up with programs, coming up with the evaluation strategy concurrently, getting the programs implemented, getting the results, and using that feedback so that you actually have a feedback process from the evaluation to make things better. Okay. I think I will skip over this one. Well, as we just mentioned quickly, is that there tends to be different documents that are prepared. And from an advocate's point of view, looking, say, starting with the bottom one, which is, say, a site-specific measurement and verification plan, you probably are not wanting to get engaged there. Where you want to get engaged, it's really up at the high level here, where there's some sort of overall guidance plan, protocol, strategy that defines what will be covered in these other documents and what the high levels of objectives, schedule, quality control, et cetera, will take place. So this is probably the document area where you want to get engaged in. Okay, so I talked about objectives and metrics, this first category. So what are our objectives here when we're doing evaluation? So there's the usual suspects, as I call them, demand savings. Of course, you want to figure out how you define that. And it doesn't take long to get into some of the nitty-gritty of utility planning as to whether you're talking about, say as they do in the Northwest, where it's just an average megawatt, or whether it's on peak. What's peak? Is it coincident with the system demand? And then things such as, are we talking about first year or life cycle savings? What are co-benefits? Other types of objectives can simply be milestones. How many homes were served? How many people were engaged? How many people were trained? Some of the limited income programs will have objectives as to, how many people were touched, how many homes were served, and then market transformation as to whether we've been changing behavior or whether we're seeing more products that are changing the products. When you're doing these, you need to come up with these objectives. You also need to have the metrics. These metrics, the specific things, how you're defining kilowatt hours, how you're defining emissions avoidance, they all plug into what the numbers are, what the data needs to be collected. It should all feed up to the evaluation effort to meet these in calculation of these objectives. And then the uncertainty, the risk associated with getting the number wrong defines your level of effort. If it's not that critical, it's a small program, nobody really cares, you don't have to put that much effort into it. If it's a big program, there's a lot of money riding on it, you're trying to use this, even though it's a small program, to really push forward things in the future, you want to get the evaluation right. And I think I've pretty well covered these. Some other ones in terms of, how will it be used, I think I've covered here, but some other things as well is, I think an area that's of great interest to us as advocates is, are we moving towards deep energy savings? And this isn't an acronym for something. It's, are we really getting, the savings? Are we being an integrated approaches here? Are we getting this and using the evaluation results to determine whether we're really moving faster along that continuum? That was my first slide. One of the other points here I just want to make on this slide here is that if you're working with an individual utility or part of a state or a region, is your information feeding into this regional analysis or the statewide analysis and what the relationship is between different utilities or different operators. This I really provide in here as a reference. Mike's gone through this, different portfolio objectives. Cost effectiveness, maybe save this for questions if people have questions about the different tests, but there's a lot of them. Typically we see the total resource or the societal test is one that tends to be preferred, at least by a lot of the efficiency advocates, because it takes into consideration so many of the benefits associated with efficiency. But clearly defining which test you're going to use is important to do early on, because each test requires certain types of data. And if you want to test, but you never collected the data, you're not going to be able to determine that metric. Some general principles, and again, I'll leave this for you as a reference for you to take a look at later. This is just not the list, or it's not even necessarily my list, but it's things to be thinking about. What is impartiality? What's meant by an impartial evaluator? Is that important? Is that the same as a third-party evaluator? How transparent are the results? Are you taking advantage of the work that's done elsewhere? And, are you focusing the effort in areas where there's the most uncertainty? These are type of principles that can be used as general guidance to the ones who are setting up these evaluation efforts that, aside from, little particular details such as use an M&V approach, it's, we want you to focus in areas where there's the greatest uncertainty or the greatest value of information. These are general principles that can be helpful to apply as well. Savings determination issues. We can get to that next slide. So, as I mentioned, we have the baselines and the different types. One common approach, as I sort of highlight at the bottom of the presentation here, is the use for new construction, end-of-life replacement type projects. Is common practice, or maybe best practice, or some sort of code and standard. whereas early replacement, that's essentially replacing a piece of equipment that's already, that's working just fine, is to use what's there now, the existing stuff, as I call it. And if you'd like to, you can maybe even do a dynamic baseline with something like that and say that the baseline for determining savings for an early replacement project is the existing equipment, but once that existing equipment is at the end of its life, you use whatever is common practice from there forward, or code and standard from there forward. As I describe that, you can start to imagine this involves a lot more data collection. So this is one of these things where it's really, when you're thinking about this, in some ways, this description right here can make perfect sense. But in order to get things like figuring out the lifetimes of replaced equipment requires a lot more money and effort. So if you have a limited budget, which all of us do, these are kind of things that you need to do trade-off is decide whether this is important enough that you want to put your energy here or somewhere else. Net and gross savings. In many ways, gross savings are the bottom line. That's what we actually care about, the reduction of energy. But what you're looking for sometimes when you have a program where you have, say, utility incentives, or as I indicated, if you're trying to figure out how to make things better, you're interested in knowing what the net savings are. Gross savings are hard to determine. Net savings tend to be very hard to determine. And it tends to be about that attribution issue that I mentioned before. The next slide. Some questions you might want to be asking as advocates. As I mentioned, is it net or gross, and what's the definition of those, and how were they determined? Was it just asking people what they would have done? Understand, again, speaking as an engineer, but people, I barely understand why I do what I do, let alone trying to go through a survey process to try to ask people what their motivations for what they did were. It gets quite complicated pretty quickly. As I mentioned, I talked a little bit earlier, this is a category of looking at this reporting analysis boundary. Again, I'll leave this for you more as a reference to be thinking about. This whole issue, these next two slides here that I have are very full of words. Let me try to summarize it quickly, and it's really highlighted in this green question that's highlighted here that you might want to be asking as an advocate. And this is an issue that's really gotten caught up in the California example of you have an estimate of what the savings are. They're called ex ante savings. And if the project is implemented and it turns out that the savings are actually less than what was assumed, do you give credit to the administrator based on the ex ante estimate, or do you give it credit based on what was actually achieved? There's some very good solid logic to doing either one, and that's one of these issues that you're probably going to be looking at, and people are interested, we can talk about that in more detail. But again, you have two slides here, this one and this next one, to provide a little bit of background on that is one of the issues you might want to be looking at. Next category, evaluation approaches, how you do about the selection. Most likely you're going to be using all of these approaches in these various programs. The key thing here is looking at what your selection guide is, what the criteria are that the evaluator is going to use to determine which ones to use. There's a lot of things that can determine which ones to use in your selection. One of the most obvious one is, the size of the program, size of the measures, size of activity. But there can be a lot of other things that are important to know. For example, you might have some really small measures that you think for the current programs are not important, but you're hoping to build those up. You're hoping to make that an important part of future portfolios. That might in itself justify, even though it's a small activity, to put a lot of effort into the EM&V. Schedules, very important to be doing evaluation concurrently with your implementation. Don't mean to keep picking on California, but I'm here in California anyway, so I'll pick on it. We've just completed the evaluation results from the 2006 through 2008 report. They came out very nicely in 2010 here. The programs have already started for 2010 before the evaluation results were done. Not terribly useful for moving forward. So we'd like to have some evaluation that you can do that is actually happening in real time so you can get feedback to the evaluator to correct issues. that also means that your planning process should also be taking place for the evaluation concurrently with the setting up of the programs. When was what's the analysis time frame? This fits into, the regulatory requirements as well as the program evaluation needs. What's the decision-making time frame? So as I gave the example, of California, the 2010 through 2012 programs, the decision what to do with those was decided in the fall of 2009, and the results from the evaluation of the prior years were available in 2010. Working to try to avoid those disconnects is a very important aspect of evaluation planning. I think I will skip. Data reporting and management. This is in some ways down in the weeds issue, but with the amount of data that comes out of these and the tracking that's involved, this is something that should be taken into consideration, and that the administrators and the evaluators have a robust system that makes this information available, and that they maintain it, and that access is provided in a transparent way for the non-confidential information. This can be a just incredibly valuable resource for understanding what's going on in the programs, and working with the administrators to have those exist can be an important part of advocacy as well. Okay, getting to the fun subject of money. This chart is my attempt. I think I first made this chart up around 1990, and you'll notice that what it tries to do is say that, what we're looking for is to find the balance point of how much effort to put into evaluation, where the incremental cost and the incremental certainty match up. So we're really looking for this point right here. The other thing you'll probably notice is there aren't any numbers down here or over here, and even though I kind of made this up in 1990, I still haven't quite figured out how to put the numbers in here. This tends to be a somewhat subjective process to figure out this balance point, and really in many ways comes down to the professional experience of the people doing evaluation to figure this out. Oh, that was my assistant providing input. So the uncertainty, what do we mean by uncertainty? From a technical point of view, there's two general sources. There's the systematic errors, things like measurement errors, calculation errors, and then there's random errors. And the most common ones that people think about that are from sampling, where you have a sampling error. So there's a lot of different types of uncertainty that take place, and when you're dealing with random error, you can potentially define it quantitatively. This is where you hear people talk about confidence and precision levels of sample sizes, their 90-10, 80-20 type thing. But that's only really covering the sampling error. The systematic errors tend to be fairly difficult to define, if not impossible, quantitatively. But you can define them qualitatively, and you can control for them. That's by doing things like ensuring proper calibration, quality control procedures. So when you have uncertainty, there's aspects that can be defined quantitatively, but there's also aspects that aren't defined quantitatively. The other aspect I want to mention in terms of this is, precision and bias. There's really two different aspects here. And what ideally you're looking for, of course, is to have a very unbiased, accurate result. And this would tend to mean that you're using the right methods and you have an adequate budget. You can be precisely wrong, which tends to be sometimes where I'm at. You can be imprecisely wrong, which is where I think a lot of our politicians are at. And you can also have, a range, but at least you've got the right methods and you're circling in on what the results are. So this is kind of a way you can look at, where you're putting your effort, and you're trying to have both good precision and minimizing bias in your results. Various things to think about. These are somewhat obvious, and again, I'll leave this as a reference document for folks. So with all these things, what do you do about it? How do you go about setting a budget and the scale and the quality? So I'll start with what's in the middle there, what's good to do, and that's to provide the answers to all these issues and questions that have been raised in this presentation. You're thinking about, come up with an iterative process of costing out various approaches, figuring out the risk associated with that, and doing a right balance. However, what's typically done is a budget's set and everything flows from the budget. Pretty much everywhere I've worked, somebody somewhere came up and said, 3%, that sounds like a good number, 2%, 1%, 5%, and then you work to that. What I think a good practical reality is, realizing that there is a budget that tends to be set through a regulatory process, but then using these goals, issues, questions that are raised in this presentation to help, put the money where it can do the most good. Question that comes up when I talk about this, of course, is, well, how much money do other people spend? And even though I try to stop and say, well, no, you really need to think about the objectives and what your risk profile is and what the information is going to be used for, it always comes back to telling people how much money is spent in other places. This table is from that report, the LBL report that I mentioned earlier. This indicates the dollars spent. You can see that in some places, a lot of money is being spent on evaluation. California is $80 million, and other places, I won't pick on anybody, where there's a lot less being spent. In terms of percentages, we're looking at probably realistically a range of, say, 2% to 4 or 5%, and so that seems to be, for whatever reason, for better or for worse, the sweet spot for evaluation budgets. And in terms of the allocation between, say, the impact work, the process, and the market research, you can see the mixes of different states and regions have been using tends to be heavily weighted towards the impact evaluation activity. Last main subject, I believe, here is who does the evaluation. Before getting into that, want to mention that there's a wide variety of tasks. This is more than just going out and counting light bulbs or putting meters on things. There's the market studies take place, the potential studies, the market assessments. There's all the planning and management activities and process evaluations, which I haven't talked about yet, but those are the evaluations that take place to try to make the program better by evaluating how the program is being implemented, all the database work. There tends to be a primary data collection activity, which is the work going out into the field and collecting information and doing the engineering calculations, the simulations, the calculations. And then there can be a secondary process where essentially an audit or review where the data collection and impact analysis that was done on the primary is reviewed, say, by a third party, maybe a commission. There's all the reporting activity, and then an important area that I always like to include is an effort associated with the evaluation, working on making sure there's time and effort associated with improving best practices in the communication. Decisions based on who does this, the realities, perceptions of conflict of interest between the administrator, evaluator, and those who are concerned about the results. Frankly, the resources and capability to manage this work and the resources to actually provide timely input. Perhaps the major issue within the EM&V industry today is that there aren't enough people who are trained and available to do this work. A common characteristic of evaluation works is that it's hard to find people to compete on competitive bids, and a lot of the reporting tends to be late. It's just people are really, really busy, even in the midst of our recession here. So it's not a small issue as to making sure that you can find the right people to do the work. Some typical roles from these different things, these are not mutually exclusive. They're just examples of different roles that evaluators have and who does this work. An administrator, such as a utility, can just conduct the EM&V with internal staff. That happens in quite a few places. Or that they hire a third-party consultant to do the work. Another option is a commission or a commission surrogate, a contractor that's hired by the commission conducts the EM&V with probably third-party consultants, or that the administrator conducts the EM&V and the commission, or again, a commission surrogate, conducts some form of review and audit. These are all these approaches are taking place in the states today. Process evaluations, those are almost always done. I can't really think of examples where it's not done by the administrator, the entity actually implementing it. There's some issues that it's good to get the results out public about how the process evaluations work, but you also want to be careful because you're trying to develop a really good working relationship between the evaluator and the administrator. And if you're trying to get information about what's going wrong as well as what's going right, it's hard to get people to open up if they think their results are going to be published in a public document before a Utilities Commission. So finding the balance there. Market evaluations, taking a look at what's happening in the marketplace, either before programs, during programs, after programs. Those also tend to be done by the administrator. They tend to be less controversial documents, and they're often done by a third-party consultant, perhaps working on a regional basis or a statewide basis. And then the planning, which in some ways is tied in with the market work, certainly the potential studies are. Again, those tend to be done by the utility as perhaps part of their IRP if they still have an IRP process. Looking at the next slide, hopefully. Oversight. So in some ways, particularly if the administrator is heavily engaged in the evaluation activity, there's different ways to provide an oversight activity and what those different roles are. One of the processes, one of the processes, and I'll see if Mike has an opinion, that took place in California that all people felt good about was something called CalMac, which was basically a group of stakeholders, the utilities as the administrators, the commission, environmental groups, ratepayer advocate groups, basically forming a committee to review both the evaluation results as well as the evaluation planning activity. Example of the roles and who does what, there's a Maryland Public Service Commission order that's in that packet that you'll find on the website. There's a matrix at the end of that that lays out the different roles, and from Maryland's point of view, which is not necessarily the right or the only way, but it was the way that work made sense for Maryland, is how those roles are split between the utilities, the commission, and third-party consulting firms. So with that, I'm going to come to conclusion here with some quotes from Albert Einstein that I think are relevant to what we're doing here. Turn it to the questions. Let me just quickly, although it doesn't seem to quickly at all go through this, let me just mention that there are a number of slides that you'll see in the web version to get into process and market evaluations and some more detail about the EM&V methods, particularly the M&V methods found in the IPMVP that you're welcome to review at your leisure, perhaps when you're having difficulty sleeping at night.
Steve?
Yes.
Let me just jump in for a second. This is Mike Messenger again. I have two questions that were posed from the audience that I think might be a good time to answer now. The first question basically is, how do we know if we got good evaluators? Is there some kind of certification for evaluators? How would you select an evaluator, particularly in regions of the country like the Southeast where it's not a tradition of lots of energy efficiency programs and evaluation? So why don't you answer that one first?
Yeah, well, we can both try to answer that one. I mean, we can start with, they need to have a really nice picture with a big smile and a nice blue tie and white shirt. That's critical. In terms of certification, the only certification that I'm familiar with is through the group that runs the IPMVP, which is the Efficiency Evaluation Organization. They have something called a Certified Measurement and Verification Professional, CMVP certification process. It was developed, and I'm on the board of the organization, so it was developed by us. It's not certified by some government, but it was our attempt to have some form of certification process for people doing measurement and verification. It's not associated with evaluation in itself, though, but it's on M&V. Generally speaking, you're looking at the qualifications and the experience of the organization doing this. There's probably 25, maybe, I'd say there's 15 to 25 firms in the world, and really almost all of them focused in the United States, that specifically do efficiency evaluation practices. It's really based on the experience that they have, I'd say, in identifying whether they have the qualifications, and the selection process through a professional, competitive solicitation process. Mike, do you know of other answers to that?
Well, no, the other thing I would say is, in another role, I'm on the board of AESP, and we have recently looked at this question of setting up a certification program for evaluators. And once we looked into it and found out sort of the levels of government review and potential legal liability for certifying and decertifying professionals based on, complaints from their clients or whatever, we decided that the market wasn't right yet to go into that. But we plan on reevaluating that every year. And if people on this call have an opinion about whether it would be worthwhile to have some kind of high-level certification, which in our mind means that there would be a written test of 1 to 2 hours in length, and you'd have to score very high in order to be certified, and then you'd have to refresh your certification every 3 years. But it didn't appear to us yet that the market was there, and we were worried about, if we got complaints, we didn't want to necessarily be exposed to all the legal liability of what happens when you decertify someone and they disagree with your decertification. So that's the answer on certification.
I've been involved with that in the United Nations for the Clean Development Mechanism offsets, and the certification of folks is quite an issue. So some questions probably good there, but there is a desire. I mean, when I talk with clients who I'm helping to hire evaluators, this might be useful for folks, is to think about it's not only the firm. A lot of the firms have very good qualifications. It comes down to who within the firm is actually committed to your project. As I mentioned earlier, there's just such a demand and lack of supply for these folks is that you might get a firm that has a very good resume, but are you going to be able to get the key people within that firm who have the actual experience? And if you get them, are they so busy with other aspects, are you actually going to be able to get their attention? And it's really gotten to the point where you can't assume that you're going to necessarily get the best person in each firm to work on your project, because there aren't enough of those, but that you understand what resources are available within that firm to work, and that there's strategies to make sure that the right resources are applied at the right time. An approach that's used by a number of the firms right now because of this is a lot of teamings going on as well to sort of provide additional resources. Okay.
So there's one other question that was raised that I think would be quite useful for you to answer, and that is, what do we do if we're just starting out and we've got a limited EM&B budget? How do you decide, where you can get the most bang for the buck? Should you spend a lot of money on process evaluation or impact evaluation or other kinds of things, setting up the tracking system? So do you have any sort of generic advice for people who are just starting up and they have a limited EM&B budget?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the, if your budget's truly limited, I mean, I'd like to say it's important to set up the infrastructure, and the infrastructure consists not only of the databases and the tools, but it's also the people. And so, working to bring in within either internal staff within the organization implementing the evaluation activities, whether that's an administrator or someone else, getting the people, and also the attitude within the organization, the evaluation is actually a useful thing. So, if it was very limited budget and I was to pick, one thing, I would probably put that into impact evaluation, partly because you can get results from that and you can show that to people and it can demonstrate to them that, yeah, there is some value here, and therefore, it's worth putting more effort into it. Secondly to that would probably be process. Process evaluation tends to be the most valuable for programs that are getting started or going through changes or that have difficulty. So having some activity associated with process, and it can be, relatively informal if it needs to be because of the budget process. It's just making sure that people step back and go, we should talk with all the people engaged in this supply chain of efficiency. The program people, the customers, the contractors. What's the feedback? What's working well? What's not working well? How can we make this program work well? This would be the other area for a focus getting going. And then again, Mike has suggestions.
So, Steve, if I can, I'm going to try to answer that question in a slightly different way. I agreed with what you said, but for us, there's like a checklist when we go into a state and try to figure out, well, how are we going to spend an EM&V budget? There's a checklist that we look at, and the first thing is, what's the program participation levels like? Are they getting rapidly growing participation level over time, or is it flat? Do they have some programs that are way below their goals? That's an indicator to us of whether there needs to be some process evaluation. The second thing we look at is we want to see the program descriptions and the program designs and see how either simple or comprehensive they are, and see, to us if they've really gotten to the meat of the issue or whether it's a pretty superficial, just repetition of somebody else's program design statement a few states over, perhaps. The third and one of the most crucial things is what's the quality of the program tracking system. When someone participates in a program, how much information is being gathered about that program participant in terms of their baseline usage, their equipment inventory, their motivation, etc. So, if we've got some problems there, we might want to spend a lot of money in just beefing up the quality of the tracking system, never mind doing any evaluation, so that we get some good information about what kinds of people are participating and why. And then finally, we look at the reporting mechanisms and try to decide, do they have enough money even to report on programs? And, what are they reporting, just ex-ante estimates, or is there some effort to try to confirm or verify savings? Based on looking at those 4 items, then we can make a good recommendation to the client about, well, based on your strengths and weaknesses in these 4 areas, we'd either put more money into program tracking, or we'd spend more money on process because you've got low participation levels. Or if we think that they're doing well there, then we tend to focus more on impact and trying to link impact measurement into cost effectiveness. So I hope that is a sort of a generic way to answer the question, and obviously on a case-by-case basis for each state, there might be a slightly different answer. So with that, are there other questions that people in the audience want to pose now to Steve? Because I have not seen any other ones. I think we've covered all the ones that I've seen pop up in the window. So I'll pause for a second.
And we can also do questions for Mike and or I on the overall area as well.
Yeah. Is anybody there?
They're all typing.
Ah, okay.
Actually, Mike, I got a question that went to me that I thought from one person that I tried to answer, and you might be more familiar with it. Can you talk about what in California, how the firewall is working between the work for the commission or work for the utilities, but not?
Sure. So let me first define what the firewall is and then tell you about whether people perceive it's working. The firewall was instituted because people did not want firms that were involved in implementing a program, working with the utility to recoup customers and bring them online, to self-evaluate that same program or a similar program in that same utility. So you didn't want, Itron to work on designing the CFL program and then evaluating it 6 to 18 months later. So the way that manifests itself in California is they said to firms, if you're going to bid on EM&V work, you have to declare that you need to certify that you haven't been worked on implementing any programs in that same sector in California for the last X number of years. And so for some firms, that required them to split the firm, essentially. They had to say, okay, we're going to form a new company that's only dedicated to implementation, and then there's going to be our old firm that's only dedicated to evaluation, and those two personnel sets and manager sets won't interact. And there's been, some people claim that that's a good result, and some people say that's just all on paper. They still work in the same building and they're still talking with each other, so the firewall hasn't really worked. The other thing I can tell you is from the consulting firm's perspective, it's not clear whether that firewall has actually worked to achieve the objective of making sure that someone who's implementing a program is not also evaluating it. From the regulatory perspective, what I've heard from the regulators is, firewall or not, we still have this problem where we have firms that are evaluating programs, and then we hear at the same time that they're also doing process evaluation and implementation work simultaneously that they never disclosed. So I would say that the record is mixed in California. It's a case of good intentions, but not a whole lot of mechanisms to actually enforce the reality. Does that cover the question, Steve?
Well, I guess if people have some more clarifications, they can type them in. We are starting to get some questions here. And it's probably good when folks have questions, if they want to send them to everyone, that way Mike and I can both see them at the same time.
So yeah, we have a question here from Seth. Steve, can you see it, or do you want me to read it to you?
There's one there. I got it.
Okay. So, you want me to take a shot at that, Steve, or you want to go for it?
Why don't you go? I'm trying. My sense is no. I haven't. I've seen. The question was relating around an absolute reduction to keep growth to a certain number, I believe, and the goals that I've seen are in units of energy as percent of growth or potentially percent of load.
Okay, so let me try to take a shot at that. Probably 5 or 6 years ago, California had some fairly aggressive statements coming out of policymakers about, we would like to see the net result of energy efficiency programs be no growth, absolutely no growth, flat growth in electricity. And we were asked to analyze, is that possible? Can we imagine a situation where the current set of program designs, if adequately funded, could reach to a point where electricity sales would flatten out over some period of time? The conclusion that I reached working at the Energy Commission and looking at some of the work that Itron had done in potential is it's possible to cut the growth rate in half, given the current mechanisms and design. So you're going from 2% per year growth to 1% per year growth. But from our perspective, that would take 10 years to do, and it would require some types of program designs that some people might not find to be realistic, let's say, within our current society. And for example, it would require penalizing people who built houses that were considered to be, quote, too big, built McMansions, and it would require some changes in program design to discourage the growth in the service demand, in addition to increasing the efficiency of providing service demand. When we gave them those answers, people didn't like it. And a lot of the policymakers said, well, forget your technical analysis, we're going to set the goal anyways. My experience has been that unless you design your program portfolio to achieve true market transformation, as opposed to just claiming a lot of savings for utility programs, it's not likely that you're ever going to get to an absolute, flattening of load, because there's too much potential to design a much more efficient building, for example, that build 20% more floor area. And the only case where I'm aware that the efficiency effect has consistently overwhelmed the structural growth effect is for refrigerators, where the standards have been so stringent that the absolute level of electricity use associated with refrigerators has declined over time, because people, aren't buying 40 square foot refrigerators. There's a physical limit to the size of refrigerators, so there hasn't been as much structural growth as there has been in places like the average size of a home, or the number of air conditioners in the house, or the number of washing machines in the house. All those things seem to have been continuing to grow despite energy efficiency programs. So that may be too long-winded of an answer, but and as an economist, I could say you're not going to get there until you couple significant increases in the price of energy with programs, because the elasticity of substitution is still such that people, with that extra money that they save from energy efficiency, will purchase more energy-using goods, and therefore not necessarily get you to your goal of flat energy sales.
Yeah, I think that's good, Mike. I mean, just speaking on that, just color points maybe reinforce that. The programs that we talk about, and the focus of this presentation was, public goods charge programs. They're incentive type programs. They're the carrot programs. They're not the stick programs. And I would agree that I don't think you're going to get there with incentive programs, and that's certainly a concern to me looking at our greenhouse gas reduction goals. I think that codes and standards, regulatory requirements, given that efficiency is actually a cost-effective, requirement, is the kind of thing that's going to need to happen. So looking at different types of programs, I think is one of the ways in which you need to look at this. From the EM&V point of view, that's also why this issue of top-down evaluation becomes more interesting and potentially much more important as we look at getting real reductions in consumption. That is something that clearly should be able to be seen on a system-wide basis, and so more interested in the top-down.
Okay. Well, the other thing I should say is, just for the interest of people on this call, the PUC has a research project underway that's trying to figure out if there are ways to do top-down savings measurement and align it with absolute savings goals based on usage, not on savings. And it's probably 6 months till that report starts, but there's a lot of people who are looking at the question of, this is unsatisfying to policymakers that you're reporting lots of savings, but we still see the overall demand for electricity going up. So we need a better metric. And so people are working on that, but I don't think the magical solution has come yet.
Okay. We had another question on this issue of the ex ante and the ex post savings approach. Actually, I had two people asked about that. So I don't know, Mike, is it appropriate to turn to that one?
Sure, yes. You want to go ahead, take a shot? Or?
It's a little tricky. I put back up on the screen one of the two slides that I had on this subject. And what I was trying to do with this particular slide was to show an approach that's used, and not necessarily the right one, but it's an approach you use to try to explain the issue. Where the history of this it comes from is that, particularly when we're dealing with deemed savings values, there's a program that's designed based on that there's a certain amount of savings come from each measure that's implemented, so many savings from each CFL or motor replacement. The administrator then goes through and runs their program on the basis of that. If it turns out that the savings in that technical reference manual or the assumptions they made from the feasibility or deemed savings value or such were wrong, then the amount of savings achieved are less. So the point from a societal point of view, I guess I would say, or a factual point of view, is that's really good information to know, and therefore the savings are what the savings are. The question becomes, in terms of achieving goals, whether from, say, a state energy efficiency regulatory requirement or payments for shareholder incentives for achieving efficiency goals, do you use the value that was ex ante, or do you use the value that's ex post? Certainly going forward, you should use the ex post value. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. The question is, from, say, a utility or administrator point of view, they, in good faith, act, using the best available information, proceeded with the activity. Should they proceed? Should they get penalized because, how would they have known and they did it in a good faith effort? On the other hand, it is what it is. Why should the ratepayers pay for something that wasn't actually achieved? I don't think there's necessarily a right answer to that. In California, they seem to be applying ex post results retroactively. Pretty much everywhere else in the country, they tend to not do that, partly because there isn't as much money on the table as there is in California. So that's trying to be a summary of the issue. Mike, I don't know if you have things to maybe clarify that or add to that.
Yeah. So, quite frankly, I have a whole other PowerPoint presentation devoted to that topic. So I'm going to try to summarize it because it's a very important question, and it depends on what problem you're trying to solve. So I'm going to give you two different perspectives. One set of people say the problem we're trying to solve with performance incentives is to make sure that the administrators are highly motivated to do the right thing and produce effective programs. And so therefore, as a result of that, we want to make sure that we use ex post measurement in developing whatever level of payment they get or penalty. And so their perspective is the problem that they're worried about is utility administrators that are potentially gold plating or even sabotaging energy efficiency programs, and so they tend to focus on ex post for that reason. And there's a desire to be sort of perfectionists and, quote, get the answer right. We know that our ex ante things were likely to be wrong, so we're going to use ex post to get it right. Okay, so that's one perspective. The other perspective is, what's the context here? What are we trying to do? Some people say, the Earth is in a lot of trouble here, and energy efficiency is one of the ways to try to deal with climate change. And as a result, we should not be so worried at all about ex post. We should be worried about maximizing the number of participants using ex ante estimates and devoting more resources to maximizing participation and gross savings than worrying about all these niceties with net savings and how much money they deserve or don't deserve for getting a certain amount of net savings. So depending on where you start from, whether you see energy efficiency as just a tool towards developing a much larger solution to a much larger problem, which is global warming and or air pollution and a variety of other things associated with fossil fuel generation, you would go one way and tend to just use ex ante and not worry about ex post that much. If, on the other hand, you think that this is much more of a trying to make sure that the program administrators are acting in good faith and are rewarded for good things and penalized for doing bad things, then you tend to move towards, we're going to use ex post results in determining their incentives and not worry so much about ex ante. So again, I don't know which of those answers is right, and it depends on a state-by-state basis, and it depends where you personally start as to whether you want to use ex ante and worry about maximizing participation or ex post and worry about maximizing the efficiency or the bang for the buck every time the utility program administrator spends a dollar. Probably the right answer is some mix in between there, but it turns out it seems to be pretty bipolar. People choose to go one way or the other. That's all I want to say about that.
Thanks, Mike. The last question as we reach the top of the hour. I saw one more question here. I think it's from your presentation, the one from Meredith, about how do you know your market? Where would an advocate go to find this information?
Well, there's lots of different places that I, as a consultant, go to find information about the market. And I can list some generic places that I go and suggest that you direct your utility program administrator to go there. The place where I tend to go first, if I don't have any information at all about what's happening in the state, I will go to one of the EIA surveys, either REX or CBEX. REX is the Residential Energy Consumption Survey, and CBEX is commercial. And that gives, very broad estimates of, for particular regions in the country, what's the saturation of key energy efficiency measures, what's the average usage on a household basis or on a square footage basis for commercial, and gives you sort of a broad outline of the level of energy efficiency that might be occurring in that area. After you get that sort of high level, then I would go back and look at, any utility-funded market research related to forecasting, because most utilities are required to forecast what future sales are, and they should be developing a fairly good picture of what the trend in energy use is likely to be based on, things like trends in housing starts and economic growth in different sectors of the economy. So that's another way of learning what the market might look like. And then the final thing I would go look at is, there's a bunch of potential studies that have been funded by a variety of different organizations. ACEEE has some, there's been some done by private consultants for states, and there's others that have been done by other advocacy organizations. And those tend to present, they have to present a picture of the market before they can do their potential estimation. So they have some useful baseline information about what the market looks like. The final thing that I would do, and I always ask clients before we do any work on programs, is I want to know straight out, what fraction of your customers know that you even run programs? You'd be very surprised to know how many people don't know the answer to that question. But it's a crucial one. If I go to a typical person in a metropolitan area in Tennessee and I ask them, did you know that your local utility, offers energy efficiency programs, and they say no, then that tells me something about where the state of development is for that particular utility area and how likely it is that people are going to be willing to participate in programs. So general awareness is another important thing. And in many cases, those are available from like Gallup or other polling organizations that have asked similar questions if the utility hasn't done it directly. So to sum up, you need to know structure of the market and just general awareness of the population, both of customers and of trade allies, about are they even aware that utility X is starting to do programs. So that's what I mean. That's what I mean by knowing the market. And if people are starting up a portfolio development process, if it was me and I was a regulator or had some influence in the process as an advocate, I'd say, our first presentation, we want to know what fraction of the market even knows you guys have programs. And then secondly, what do you know about what level of the market has already invested in certain types of energy efficiency, either measures or systems that you might be promoting? So that's my answer to that question. Thanks.
Yeah, Mike, the other thing I'd sort of add to that, speaking to a group of advocates, is to look at opportunity to talk with some of the business groups that do efficiency. And there are more and more of those that take place that are existing now. There's a Northwest Energy Efficiency Council, Northeast Energy Efficiency Council, California Energy Efficiency Council. I know there's a brand new group in Colorado. There's the West Energy Efficiency Alliance. There's now a Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance. These groups are structured differently and have some different objectives, but many of them are made up of companies that are doing energy efficiency work. In one, they can be a good source of information about what's happening in the marketplace, and two, they can be a really excellent colleague for advocacy work, where you find areas of common ground. In my experience in working with those groups and being part of some of those business groups, we work very well with the environmental community as an example to drive positive energy efficiency policy.
Okay, so
combination of the environmental and business connection.
So Steve, if it's all right with you, I want to try to wrap up now. And the way I want to do that is to let people know of two things. After I close down this presentation, there's going to be a link that comes up immediately on your screen to SurveyMonkey. And in that SurveyMonkey, there's two things that we'd like you to do if you have the time. One is to provide feedback to RAP on whether Steve and I did a good job or not. And there's several questions where you can rate our competency and speaking skills and whatever else you'd like to comment on. And then after that, we have a questionnaire that we've set up that basically tests, did some of the concepts that we've been talking about here make it through and wrap around and hit in your brain, so that when we ask you a question, a multiple choice question, you'll be able to say, oh yeah, I know the answer to that. There's 3 different forms of evaluation. They are X, Y, and Z. So there's a little self-scoring test where you can take the test. There's only 10 questions, and they cover, the material covered in these slides. And then if you'll just fill that out and click submit, we will, quote, score your answers and send you back, you got 90%, you're an excellent student, or 50%, you must not have heard what we said, or whatever your score will be. And then we will post the answers to these questions 2 weeks from now on the website for people who want to go back and see what, at least Steve and I think, the correct answers to the tests are. So we'd appreciate it if you take your time to either fill one or both of those surveys out. And the final thing I want to mention is, after I shut off here, the WRAP website itself has all of the reference and documentation materials that we've referred to here. So if you want to go look at the Portfolio Best Practices study, or you want to see a typical program template, you can download it straight off and have it. And I'm going to, I think I can post that. Let's just see.
Yeah, Mike, I put up the web address for that earlier, and one person wrote back indicating that it didn't. Oh, there you go. That there was actually, your presentation wasn't up there.
Yeah, we'll work on making sure
that. Take a look, and we'll get that to WRAP too. And I'm sure if it's not there, they'll put it up, within a day or so.
So if you look on your screen now, I'm just going to show you that we've, first of all, we got the WRAP URL, and then in the website, once you go there, you'll be able to click on each of these bullets here and download these documents that we've been speaking about during this presentation, the best practice, the issues and opportunities, and you can read all those. And we'll make sure that all the presentations we thought they were there, but it sounds like maybe the Making a Difference one isn't there now, and we'll try to make sure that happens.
Yeah, well, actually, there was one titled Making a Difference. It might not be the right one, so we'll take a look and double-check it. Okay, and then for those of you who are interested in asking us more detailed questions or just getting back to us, the last two slides here, there's my bio and my email address, and I think Steve's bio and his email address, and some of the references to organizations that he referenced, like the Efficiency Evaluation Organization, are all there. So our goal is to provide you with lots of tools if you want to follow up on some of the things we said today, and this is where you can go. So with that, I guess I want to say thank you very much for listening, and again, I'm going to turn off the recording button here and exit the